The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by Rusty Quill and licensed under a Creative Commons attribution. Okay, I'll stop. I wish I could say the Magnus Archives needs no introduction, but unless you're a very specific kind of person, i.e. a Tumblr user, I highly doubt you've heard of it. And to me, that's frankly insane. The Magnus Archives is one of the most interesting, well-written, and at points terrifying pieces of fiction ever written. It is a masterwork in online horror and in sound design, and it deserves to be the most listened to podcast of all time. But it's not. It's garnered quite the audience, don't get me wrong. The Kickstarter for the sequel podcast, which we'll get into in a separate video, earned £700,000, or just under $1 million in the short time it was up, but by no means is the podcast a household name like it deserves to be. To be honest, I largely chalk that up to Spotify's lack of willingness to promote fiction podcasts. I mean, seriously, the only podcasts I've ever listened to on Spotify have been horror fiction podcasts, and the only thing Spotify has ever recommended to me have been true crime podcasts and shit from Joe Rogan lookalikes. Perhaps it's conspiratorial to say that Spotify has a hand in downplaying the Magnus Archive's success, but I see no way this podcast doesn't go crazy. You know what I mean? Let me get real with you. This video had some major troubles before it even began production, and let's not talk about the troubles it had while it was in production. The main issue I had to face was the question of how not to spoil the entire show. I will spoil the show quite substantially, but, I still want you all to go out and experience it for yourselves. This show has an insane amount to offer, even if you already know all the plot beats that are about to happen. I know this for a fact because the recent listen through I did for this video was my third, and I enjoyed it nearly as much as I did the first time. So before we keep chatting, I implore you, put this video down and go listen to the show yourself. It's long, sure, but each episode has enough to keep you engaged. Seriously, go watch it, or listen to it. When I say go watch it, I mean listen to it. The Magnus Archives has no visual element, but you know what I mean. That being said, I know the side of the internet I'm catering to here. Most of the people who watch this video will never watch the Magnus Archives, or have already seen it, and that's fine. I do ask you give the show a try, but if that's not on the table, then you're still welcome to sit here and watch me dive into the show. If you've already watched the show, you may be annoyed by the small details I get wrong, and while I am an idiot, I am also getting some small details wrong on purpose. At the end of the day, I'm trying to create a narrative within this video, and if getting a day or two wrong assists that, I am not above it. If you hate that, feel free to tell me how much you hate it in the comments. I do enjoy reading them. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about how the show is structured. There are 5 seasons consisting of 40 episodes each. Each episode is about 20 minutes long, though some are much longer, and they usually start with a small conversation at the beginning before a reading of a quote-unquote statement, and then after that a conversation at the end. That's the general formula, but the show is absolutely willing to deviate from it, and I count that as one of its many strengths. We won't be covering each episode in exhaustive detail. I'll largely be skipping over the majority of the actual statements, but, if an episode is relevant, we will talk about it. And we will talk about some of the statements. And just for the record, we will be stopping a lot. There are a lot of relevant characters, especially in the earlier seasons. And with that out of the way, I believe we've fully set up the video. We can actually start talking about the show now. We open to our main character, Jonathan Sims, the head archivist of the Magnus Institute. The Institute is a research and archival operation dedicated to cataloguing and researching the quote-unquote esoteric and paranormal. The head of the Institute, Elias Bouchard, recently hired Jonathan to replace Gertrude Robinson, the previous head archivist, who recently passed away. John had been working at the Institute as a researcher for 4 years prior to his promotion, and is clearly unimpressed with the organizational skills of Gertrude. John has been working at the Institute for a while prior to the start of the series, and is thus quite familiar with the Institute's workings. People come in, give a statement on a paranormal experience they've had, the archivists listen and catalogue it before it's sent to the archives. Most of these statements either go nowhere or are jokes, and it would seem the archives are not held in particularly high regard. The Institute was founded in 1818, nearly 200 years ago at the start of the series. As it would seem, most of these statements have either been written via a typewriter or have been recorded onto a tape recorder. The archives have clearly not made the switch to digital in the slightest. A small note to add to that, John mentions that his attempts to port the audio from the tape recorders to his laptop have resulted in severe distortions in the audio, which is kind of interesting. John is taking the effort of organizing the archives very seriously, so much so that he comes off as a bit of a prick, and he has thus enlisted 3 researchers to help him: Timothy Stoker, Sasha James, and Martin Blackwood, though John seems to have very little faith in Martin's abilities. Those three will be responsible for doing supplementary investigations into the statements given by witnesses, and we'll be hearing from them much, much later. Let's actually pause here to put the names we've got on the board. These are all vital players in the show, so we'll stick them at the top. Anyway, now let's get into the meat of the episode, the actual statement. John reads out the testimony of a person on a supernatural event that happened to them. These are the best bits of the show, and I will be taking pains throughout this video not to spoil the contents too much. It's like I said, even if you know the plot beats that are coming, the writing still has a huge amount to offer you. John reads the testimony of a man named Nathan Watts. He went to a party in Edinburgh and got horribly drunk. On the way home, he met a man standing just outside an alley asking for a cigarette. Nathan was suddenly overcome by a feeling of wrongness and fled after realizing the man's mouth wasn't moving as he asked for the cigarette. He returned the next day to find a pack of Marlboro Reds where the man had been, and in the following days he hears that someone else at that party went missing, one John Fellows. His missing poster featured a pack of Marlboro Reds sticking out of his pocket. The statement ends there, and John entirely discounts Nathan's testimony as he was heavily drunk during the encounter. Still, he had Sasha look into it, and she discovered that there had been 6 disappearances in that area between 2005 and 2010. One of these names is relevant here, Ashley Dobson. Before she went missing, she sent a photo to her sister with the caption, quote-unquote, "Check out this drunk creeper, lol." The photo matched the alley Nathan described, and there initially didn't appear to be anyone there, though when Sasha brightened the image, a long, thin hand was revealed reaching out from the alleyway, seemingly beckoning. That's the first episode, and we learned quite a bit, though much of what we learned was just background information. Still, we know that the archives are old, deal with the paranormal, and that they are in a state of deep disarray. Episode 2, while not including as many necessary details, does include some relevant information. It starts with Joshua Gillespie traveling to Amsterdam with friends to get drunk and all of that stuff. He's approached by a man named John, who offers him £10,000 to look after a quote-unquote package. Josh accepts, but immediately regrets his decision, though by that point it's too late. He leaves for home and waits a year to spend any of that money, and by the time he spends it, he's convinced that realistically, this guy John could never find him. Mere days after he spent some of that money, 2 massive delivery men arrive and deliver a large package to him. Josh opens it and sees that it's a coffin. This is the item he's supposed to look after. Josh does so for about a year before John arrives to pick it up with those same 2 delivery men in tow. As the men carry the coffin out of his apartment, John rushes to watch them go and catches sight of the van the delivery men drive. The van is labelled Breekon and Hope. Tim digs around post-statement and finds that Breekon and Hope were a delivery company that went into liquidation in 2009, making finding any statements on what they carried quite hard. Let's make note of Breekon and Hope in our heads real quick. The next relevant episode is number 3. I promise we're not actually going to go over every episode. The first few just have a lot of relevant names and info. It follows Amy Patel, an office worker who takes a nighttime criminology course. It's there she meets Graham Folger. The two become acquainted and interact very little until one night Amy spots Graham taking the same bus back home as her. She approaches him and makes conversation, and they both head back home. Turns out they live just across the road from each other, and as they're walking back, Amy is suddenly pushed into the road. Amy notes that Graham took no part in the pushing as he was in front of her at the time, but despite that, the injury still gives Amy quite a nasty head wound. She's concussed and, as such, follows Graham back to his apartment. Nothing untoward happens, and they struggle to make good conversation as Amy is drawn to a table in Graham's room. It's an antique and is quite beautiful, the lines drawing towards the center but seemingly never making contact with it as the table has a large hole in the center. Amy decides to leave soon after and heads back to her apartment. Days later, she realizes she can see Graham through her apartment window and she starts to watch him. On April 7th, 2006, she came home and started watching Graham's window. She soon realized that there seemed to be a new water pipe just below the window that she hadn't noticed before. Then that pipe moved. It gently glided up into Graham's window like a snake, slithering through the divots in brick before it was entirely in Graham's apartment. Amy, with a jolt, realized that the pipe was actually an arm. She called the police before she saw a man in Graham's apartment, completely different to Graham's appearance in every way. Police arrived and searched the flat, but they didn't seem to find anything strange, even looking at Graham's passport at one point. Then they left. The man in Graham's apartment spends the rest of the night staring into Amy's window. From all that Amy could find, this new man had essentially taken over Graham's life, and nobody but her seemed to notice that he was not the original Graham. She moved to a different part of the country shortly after a run-in with this new Graham, where he promised to, quote-unquote, return the visit one day. After the statement, Tim is able to find Amy's medical records, which suggested that she didn't actually suffer any of the latent effects of the head trauma, and even better than that, Tim is able to find old Polaroid photos of Graham pre-transformation, proving that he at one point existed. This is important. I'm taking this as confirmation that the Anglerfish, which we'll call it from now on, as it was named in episode 1, is real and is almost certainly supernatural. I mean, 2 people have testimonies of a long, thin creature that seems to steal the identities of people that it kills. These testimonies are from 2 people who have never met, who live in separate places, and saw this thing at separate times. I think that's enough evidence to slap the Anglerfish up on the board. Anyway, next episode we need to focus on is number 4. It follows Dominic Swain, a theatre technician who heads to Notting Hill and into an Oxfam, which, for my American viewers, is a charity store, to kill some time. While there, he ends up finding an expensive-looking book bound in real leather for just £4. It's called Ex Altiora, and the sentence, "From the library of Jürgen Leitner," is inscribed in a bookplate on the cover. A number of odd occurrences begin to happen to Dominic, including intense feelings of vertigo that remind him of a childhood friend, one Michael Crew, who was struck by a bolt of lightning. Eventually he's referred to one Mary Keay, a book dealer who dealt with Leitner. He visits Keay, who is absolutely bizarre, and shows him another Leitner that seems to be able to produce a seemingly endless supply of bones. Swain is terrified by this and flees. He's visited shortly afterwards by Gerard Keay, Mary Keay's son, who offers to buy the book from Swain for £5,000. Swain takes him up on that, and while Gerard is collecting the money, he Googles Mary Keay. Swain finds an article detailing how Mary Keay was killed by Gerard in 2008, immediately before Gerard arrives and knocks on his door. Slightly terrified, Swain allows Gerard back into his apartment, who then takes the book and burns it right in front of Swain before leaving. Anyway, lots of very interesting stuff this episode. John mentions in the after episode section that he thought they had dealt with, quote-unquote, what remained of the Leitner library after the incident in 1994, which makes me think that Leitner seems to be quite important. Well, we aren't going to add them to the board just yet. I do think... Anyway, we're going to skip episode 5 because it's not entirely relevant to us. That being said, it is a great episode and it is well worth a listen. We are going to cover episode 6 though. We follow Timothy Hodges. He heads to a club in 2014 where he meets a woman named Harriet Lee. They dance and eventually head back to Hodges' apartment to have sex. While there, Harriet breaks down and explains that she'd been mugged recently. A woman in a red dress had run up to her before Harriet got a terrible pain in her stomach. Assuming she'd been stabbed, she went to the hospital but was dismissed as there seemed to be nothing wrong with her. That woman in the red dress had stayed in the corner of Harriet's eye since the incident, so Harriet was trying to avoid being alone. They go on to have sex, and afterwards Hodges rests his head on her shoulder before he feels something slithering beneath her skin. He shoots up, though Harriet seems to give little sign she noticed. Suddenly she doubles over and Hodges shoots out of the room to get her a glass of water. While he's outside, he hears a terrible wet cracking sound, and when he re-enters the room, he sees a pitted mass of flesh in a pile on the bed, the rest of the room covered in a thick black fluid, worms writhing all throughout it. Hodges flees the apartment and sets fire to it. Sasha looks into the matter after the statement and is able to show that the police report found no evidence of arson and no human remains in the flat, though they did find quote-unquote organic matter. Harriet Lee can also be confirmed to have existed and to have been reported missing around that time. John remarks that the attacker matches the description and last known location of Jane Prentiss. Now, this is the first time we're hearing of Prentiss, but John seems to be quite familiar with her, and it would seem convinced that this Jane Prentiss is supernatural in some way, so we'll put her up on the board. We skip past episode 7 and go into episode 8. It follows one Ivo Lensick, a builder recounting his experiences at Hilltop Road. Fun fact, Hilltop Road is a fictional street in Oxford, the city that I live in. I had actually been to the place where Hilltop Road is supposed to be before I listened to this episode, so when I heard locations that I knew and had visited being mentioned as places in this episode, I borderline shit my pants. That's besides the point though. The episode follows Mr. Lensick as he does work at 105 Hilltop Road on short notice. One day, as Ivo kept doing work into the evening and everyone else at the site left, a man knocked on the door and claimed to be Raymond Fielding, the owner of the house, and With a seemingly legitimate deed, Mr. Lensick let him in. Lensick was deeply unsettled by the man and tried to continue working before he heard a small sound. Raymond had disappeared, leaving nothing but a small patch of charred, burnt flooring and the smell of burnt hair. As Lensick went to get the fire extinguisher to put the burnt flooring out, he knocked his head, falling unconscious. He woke up in the hospital soon after. As Ivo recounted his experience to the doctor, the nurse attending him, Anna, seemed to listen in, and so the next time he saw her, he asked her about Hilltop Road. She told him that in the 1960s it was a halfway house for runaway teens run by a man named Raymond Fielding. One day he brought in a new girl to the house, Agnes Montague, and soon after her arrival, the other kids at the halfway house started to disappear. This kept happening until Agnes was about 19 and the only child left in the house. Then Raymond disappeared. Soon after, local pets started disappearing, and then a young boy. Soon after that, the house burnt down. Agnes's bones were not found in the rubble, though Raymond's were, missing his right hand for some reason. Lensick went back to work slightly unsettled and made an effort to not be alone in the house anymore. That effort failed one night when he didn't realize how late it had gotten. As he started to leave, he heard a knock at the door. It was a priest named Edwin Burroughs, sent by Anna to perform an exorcism on the house. Ivo let the man in and left him to perform his rites. Ivo let the man in and went to the garden to give the priest some space. While in the garden, he was suddenly struck by an overwhelming hatred for a large tree. He stuck a crowbar into it and watched as blood began to flow from it. Still overcome by that same hatred, he tied a chain around it and uprooted the tree, revealing a box beneath it. He opened the box and found a perfectly preserved apple, which quickly dissolved into spiders. Ivo then destroyed the box and threw it away, leaving Hilltop Road forever. That was a lot, and it makes very little sense here. It does feel kind of like creepypasta-y, if you know what I mean. Like, oh, I struck a tree and then blood began to flow from it, and then I uprooted the tree and then there was an apple under it, and then the apple dissolved into spiders. Like, okay, settle down. I'm sure there's some symbolic significance to it that we'll find out later. Hopefully. Let's keep going with episode 9. It follows Julia Montauk, the daughter of renowned serial killer Robert Montauk. She grew up in Dartford before her mother disappeared when she was 7. Julia notes that Robert spent the next few years drinking and quote-unquote working in the shed. Years later, the house got a call from a Detective Rayner, which Julia picked up. She had a short and strange conversation with the man before handing it over to Robert, who had a pointed conversation with Rayner before acquiescing to the demand it would seem Rayner was making. Years later, Julia woke up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water. The tap refused to produce anything drinkable, though, producing only dark, brackish water. As she stood dumbfounded at the strange liquid, she heard knocking at the door before she looked out the front window and noticed the lamps down the street going out one by one. The knocking turned to a banging, and Julia ran to the shed as the closest light to the house burst. The door was bust down, and whatever creature was behind it gave chase. Julia entered the shed to see her father holding a dagger in one hand and a man's heart in another. Looking around, she saw a number of preserved hearts scattered across the walls, all beating in unison. The creature reached Julia, and just before it could fully get to her, Robert plunged the dagger into the heart he was holding, seemingly making this creature disappear. Soon after, the police arrived and Robert fled. He was caught, arrested, and later died in prison. John mentioned soon after that the man Robert killed was a member of the People's Church of the Divine Host, a cult that dissolved in 1994, led by the defrocked Pentecostal minister Maxwell Rayner. So, more themes. Let's keep our eyes out for brackish water, darkness, and a creature that seemingly follows that darkness. The next episode is number 10. It follows Trevor Herbert, a homeless man suffering from lung cancer, and a self-proclaimed vampire hunter. He recounts several experiences he had with vampires throughout the years, one taking the life of his brother and another nearly killing him. We get a fairly complete description of these vampires and their abilities throughout the statement, though Trevor apparently succumbs to his lung cancer at the end of the statement, failing to give us any more information. Still, we got a general description. Trevor describes them as having bodies resembling humans but without many of the internal mechanisms to match, lacking rib cages, windpipes, and likely bones as a whole. They have large mouths with massive rows of teeth that Trevor described as shark-like, and a long snake-like tongue that attaches to their victims to drain them of blood. Trevor also mentions that the vampire doesn't talk and seems to make its thoughts known through some other means, and once they're fed, they seem to enter a state of rest. Trevor mentions they're highly flammable and seems to have paralyzed one by pushing a stake through its heart. The idea of a creature that pretends to be human is a theme we've seen before in the Anglerfish, though those two don't seem to have much connection past that. We're not going to stick the vampires on the board just yet, but it's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Episode 11 is written by one Antonio Blake, though we find out after the statement that it's probably a fake name. The statement regards a dream he had about Gertrude Robinson. Over the past decade, he has had these prophetic dreams. In these dreams, he sits in a frozen version of our world, only that world is covered in thick, pulsating red tendrils. These tendrils seem to grow greater based on how soon and how terrible the person's death would be, feeding into limbs, heads, and chests. Over the course of these dreams, he sees several people he knows with large tendrils feeding into them. These people die seemingly unavoidable deaths afterwards. The reason Antonio is here is because of a dream he had recently. He was in London and all the tendrils in the city seemed to be feeding into the Institute. They led him into the archive room, all of them feeding into Gertrude Robinson, her eyes open in terror. This statement is frankly a bit of a nothing burger, but John seems to be oddly convinced by it. He's been extremely critical of all the statements we've heard up until now, even the ones containing proof of a creature's existence, but he seems to take this nonsense statement at face value. We can't really put it on the board since it doesn't have any names we can add, but let's just keep the name Antonio Blake, or the guy that it represents, in mind. Okay, episode 12 also has an important name, so we're just going to go over that really quickly. It's written by Lesere Saraki and recounts 2 burn victims she encountered while working as a nurse at St. Thomas Hospital. The first burn victim was entirely covered in second-degree burns, though his clothes seemed to be completely undamaged and he was alive. The second victim was also completely burnt in the same way, except for a line on his neck, above which everything else seemed to be undamaged. An old passport on that second man showed him to be Gerard Keay. Besides that passport, the only thing he had on him was a lighter with an eye on it. Later, as Lesere was walking past the room, she heard the first man chanting, Asag, Weepalach, the Lightless Flame. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. I think that's Lashuchu? Lashuchu Killer from the first Magnus Archives video, who fucking flamed me for not being able to pronounce Polish words. I'm sorry. This man that was chanting was hot to the touch and, slightly freaked out, returned to the reception before realizing everyone else there had left. Suddenly she heard what she described as the quote-unquote growl of a beast, and watched as the drinks in a nearby vending machine boiled and exploded. She turned to run to the exit, but was stopped as the handles warped, giving off intense heat. As the chanting got louder, she came back to the room where the man was, and she saw that Gerard had sat up, seemingly unaware of any pain he should have been in. He asked Lesere if the ambulance had brought a book bound in red leather and a brass pendant with them, and when she responded that they hadn't, he went to a storage closet and picked up a scalpel, clearly intending to kill the man. Lesere chose to allow him to kill the man, and in turn Gerard said, and I quote, "Yes, better for you the beholding than the lightless flame." He plunged the scalpel into the man's throat, and the man cremated all at once, taking the scalpel with him. Lesere left the room to dispose of the ashes before seeing that the people had returned to the hospital as if nothing had happened. Gerard didn't wake up in the hospital again and was given to his mother for care 4 days later. Lesere still works in the ward, but keeps getting the feeling that she's being watched, especially around that room. We get a few remarks after the statement. Sasha confirms that Gerard Keay and the other man did arrive at that hospital with burn wounds. John remarks that Asag is a demon in Sumerian myth, said to have boiled fish in a river because of its ugliness, and Martin suggests that Weepalach, I'm so sorry, the Polish word for to cauterize or brand. We also get confirmation that Gerard Keay is dead, dying in 2014 from a brain tumor. Finally, Sasha noticed that on the CCTV she was able to retrieve from the hospital, everyone in A&E seemed to stand up and leave the building at some point. Lesere can then be seen entering and exiting several times before everyone returns. At one point the footage seems to cut out momentarily and is replaced by one frame of a human eye pressed into the camera. So let's talk about what we just heard. First things first, Gerry was a real person but is now dead. I am going to put him and his mother on the board since his mother also seems to have died at some point and then come back. Next, let's talk about the Lightless Flame. We don't have much to go on here, but it definitely sounds like a cult to me. I'd imagine given the powers the chanting man seemed to have, it probably has to do with fire and heat, and given some of the after-statement remarks, I'd imagine that the beholding is also a cult. Gerard seems to place himself alongside the beholding earlier in the statement, so I'm going to make a quick mental note of that before we continue. Let's quickly review here. Thus far we've encountered 2 things that we can definitively call real, those being the Anglerfish, confirmed on 2 separate occasions, and the Church of the Divine Host, which was confirmed to be real by the UK police, though we should mark down that it no longer exists. We can confirm a supernatural entity and a cult. Everything else we've gotten thus far, can't be confirmed, at least not fully. We're going to skip episodes 13, 14, 15, and 16, but I will mention that the Lucas family is mentioned in 13 to be patrons of the archives, and a man named Mikaele Salesa is mentioned in 14 to be a curios dealer. Also, episode 15 is one of the greatest pieces of horror media ever made, but that's besides the point. That felt good. I'm skipping 4 episodes, I mean. I was beginning to get worried I was going to have to talk about nearly every episode this season, but that fear has been thoroughly assuaged. Let's talk about episode 17. We follow Sebastian Adekoya, a postgraduate student working at a library in Chiswick. He says that a copy of Trainspotting had been mislabeled and is actually a book entitled The Bone Turner's Tale. He mentions a book plate in the front and says later that it had a Scandinavian name on it, which we can assume to be Jürgen Leitner. He does a small search for who had returned the book and found that a man named Michael Crew had returned it 3 weeks prior. That's where Jared Hopsworth comes in. He and Sebastian had once been good friends, but that relationship deteriorated when Sebastian went to university. At this point we get to hear the voice of our second character on the board, Mr. Elias Bouchard himself. He and John have a short conversation, and John mentions that Martin is off with stomach problems before they get back onto the statement. Jared started harassing Sebastian, and that came to a head when one day Jared arrived at the library to annoy Sebastian before noticing the Bone Turner's Tale, grabbing it and leaving. Weeks later, Jared's mother returned the book, cloaked in a large coat with her arm in a sling at an unnatural angle. Sebastian attempted to put the book out of his mind, but failed and returned to the library at 2 a.m, only to find that all of the books on the card that housed the Bone Turner's Tale appeared to be bleeding in a very 2012 creepypasta sort of scene once more. As he started reading the book, the glass of the library shattered as a man who Sebastian didn't recognize entered, demanding in Jared's voice that the book be given to him. Sebastian refused and punched the man, failing to do any real damage as the man's skin seemed to suck him in. Sebastian screamed and dropped the book, at which point the creature, which Sebastian believed to be Jared, took the book and ran away. So lots to talk about here. Firstly, we have another mention of Michael Crew, who returned a Leitner to this library for seemingly no reason. Michael Crew has been tangentially connected to 2 Leitners, and we've heard very little of the man past that. And we have a second Leitner, the Bone Turner's Tale. It seems to be able to manipulate flesh in some way. If I had to guess, it's probably able to manipulate bones instead of flesh. No reason why I would say that, though. Anyway, I'm going to add Michael Crew to the board since he's been mentioned twice now, and I'm going to add Jared Hopsworth to the board, and I'm going to throw the Bone Turner's Tale up onto the other board that we've been keeping, the one for objects. Hey, this is editing, Jamie. I just realized that I never said that I was putting together a board for the supernatural objects that are being accrued. That's my bad. I'm doing that right now. We skip right to episode 19, which is a 2-parter recounting the testimony of Father Edwin Burroughs, the priest from episode 8. Father Burroughs is recounting this from inside prison, as he was arrested in 2009 for murdering and eating 2 Oxford students. We aren't actually going to go over the details of the episode, other than to say that Breekon and Hope gets a minor mention towards the end of the episode. Because of that second mention, I feel pretty comfortable putting Breekon and Hope on the board. Episode 21 has a shocking amount of significance. It is the account of Miss Moira Kelly on how her son was quote-unquote swallowed by the sky. This son was a skydiving instructor who was brought up to help one Simon Fairchild jump for charity. As her son jumped, Simon Fairchild shouted something to him. It sounded like "Enjoy Sky Blue," and after jumping, the son spent what felt like days falling through the sky, his face being stung by howling winds and needles of rainwater before he eventually hit the ground. He had only been up in the sky for 15 minutes, much longer than he should have, but definitely less than the days he felt he'd spent up there. He quit skydiving on the spot and returned home to Miss Kelly. She took him on a walk a day or so later after they'd had that conversation, and while on this walk, her son got a look of sudden terror and started running before the sky reached down and swallowed him. He was never seen again, and the end of the episode strongly implies that he never hit the ground. John mentions that the name Simon Fairchild sounds familiar, while Martin busts down the door covered in worms. Martin explains to us in episode 22 how he went looking for a lead from a previous episode and, while doing so, met Jane Prentiss. He gives very little description of her, but it would seem that the red dress she was wearing in episode 6 has been replaced by a trench coat. It would also seem Prentiss has the ability to produce a seemingly endless supply of worms from within herself, which is sick. I wish I could produce that many worms. Martin was under siege for 2 weeks while Prentiss stood directly outside his front door, attempting to send worms into his apartment. Eventually, she left and Martin ran to the Institute, where John tells him to crash until Prentiss disappears. After the statement is taken, John gets a text from Martin's phone, which he dropped while fleeing Prentiss. The text reads, quote-unquote, "Keep him, we have had our fun. He will want to see it when the archivist's Crimson Fate arrives." So I feel quite comfortable putting Jane Prentiss down as our second confirmed entity. 2 separate people have had run-ins with her, her worms are definitely real, and one of the people who encountered her was an archival assistant. Prentiss is real, and she is almost certainly supernatural in nature. Not only that, but she is actively hunting archival assistants, and she seems to be currently near the archives. I'm actually going to move her to the middle of the board and slap an exclamation mark on her, since she seems to be actively stalking the archives. We're going to skip over episode 23 and 24, but they do have some relevant information that I'll mention quickly. First off, Mr. Magnus was a real person, that is not a joke. The Magnus archives are named after a dude named Magnus. Jonah Magnus, that is. Jonah Magnus founded the archives in 1815, and although he's obviously dead by this point, he will probably appear again in later episodes. 24 also mentions one Gerard Orsinov as being the ringleader of a Russian circus that once had possession of a supernatural calliope, although it now seems to be in the archives. We'll add that calliope to the object board as well. Sasha's also in episode 24, which marks her first appearance. Episode 25 follows Mark Billum, recounting his experience of his girlfriend's flatmate Natalie Ennis. Natalie became embroiled in a darkness-related cult soon after her mother's passing, unscrewing the light bulbs in their shared flat, and largely not going outside during the day. Eventually, she tried to convert Billum's girlfriend, and after failing, fled to a nearby church afterward. Billum followed her and was completely engulfed in darkness as he was surrounded by chanting figures. Eventually, he managed to remember that he had a phone with a flashlight on it, and as soon as he turned the light on, the darkness and the chanting disappeared. It would seem that the People's Church of the Divine Host is still operational. We knew they existed, but the fact that they're still around is new to us, so let's mark that down on the other board. John also mentions that the chanting of the people in the darkness sounded very similar to Ny Alesund, which is the northernmost settlement in the world, and also the one that receives the least light in the winter. Episode 26 is one of the most important episodes we've had thus far, and it is given to us directly by Sasha James, one of our archival assistants. She recounts an experience she had recently where she saw a distorted man. He was tall with long blonde hair that stretched past his shoulders and fingers that seemed to be the size of his torso. Sasha saw him a few times before he motioned for her to come have a conversation, introducing himself as Micheal and telling her that he wanted to help. He told her to come to Hanwell Cemetery should she want to save the life of her co-workers. Sasha obviously did so, and alongside Micheal, ended up finding the rotting, infested body of Timothy Hodges, our man from episode 6. It attempted to infect Sasha, and as she dashed away, she came upon a CO2 extinguisher. She sprayed the creature and it quickly died. Before she could turn to Micheal, she felt an extraordinary pain in her shoulder. She looked over and saw Micheal reaching into her, his fingers long and thin. He pulled a worm out of her shoulder and threw it to the ground where it died. We learned a lot here. First, let's address the benefit of the doubt I'm about to give to Sasha. I'm putting Micheal on the board, even though Sasha is the only person who's actually confirmed his existence. The reason why I'm doing this is that John believes her, and like I said, he knows way more than you and I do right now. We have further confirmation that not only is Prentiss real, but she is dangerous. We've discovered her weakness though, she can be killed via CO2. Final note, Sasha mentions that Tim is obsessed with an architect named Robert Smirk. Let's put him on the object board. We're going to skip episodes 27 through 31 as they don't contain many relevant names or info, though I will mention a few brief things. Firstly, episode 27 introduces Melanie King, who will be very relevant later on. She runs a ghost hunting YouTube channel and seems to have inexplicable beef with John. Episode 33 follows Jane Prentiss herself. This one is really odd. It was recorded before Jane Prentiss fully dropped her humanity and became this kind of walking beehive, to put it one way. And honestly, very little of note is said. Prentiss spends a lot of this episode trying to describe how much, in her words, she both hates and deeply wants to be full of worms. And that's really all there is to say. Episode 33 follows Carlita Sloan, a sailor that joined the Tundra, a ship captained by Peter Lucas, who we've already mentioned. He's a member of the Lucas family, remember that? Sloan describes how the ship was almost entirely silent, despite the crew being full. Almost nobody spoke, and Sloane eventually discovered that the ship, despite carrying a massive amount of cargo boxes, was not actually carrying any cargo. The boxes were just empty. Eventually, she and the rest of the crew went overboard on a lifeboat, leaving one crew member behind. They went back to the ship shortly after, and the atmosphere lightened, though that one crew member was nowhere to be seen. John reveals at the end of the episode it seemed that one crew member was left adrift in the ocean for nearly 6 months before dying. John seems extremely suspicious of Peter Lucas, but was explicitly told by Elias not to look any further into the family, as they're major financial contributors to the archives. We'll stick Peter Lucas onto the board since he does seem to be relevant here. Episode 34 doesn't contain any relevant names, but it contains very relevant information. The statement is given to us directly by Dr. Lionel Elliott, a professor in medicine who taught a class of 7 students. The names I'm about to recount won't show up again, but I want you to listen closely to them and try and figure out why they're odd. The class Dr. Elliott taught consisted of these 7 students: Erica Musterman, Jan Novak, Pyotr and Pavel Petrov. These 2 were brothers. John Doe, Forlan Alfolani, and Juan Perez. Let me give you a moment. Okay, enough of that. Those 7 names are the placeholder names for the majority of countries across the world. Side note, those students also seem to be able to shift their anatomies at will and didn't understand how to act human, asking odd questions and doing unnecessary things like sitting in class for the entire period even when it was clear their teacher wasn't going to show up. We've got yet another instance of creatures that appear human but just aren't. This theme definitely feels relevant, but let's put it on the back burner for now. Episode 35, 36, and 37 have some relevant info which we'll go over quite quickly. Firstly, Gerard Keay makes another appearance, and he seems to be looking for more Lightners. It would also seem the book Mary Keay produces Infinite Bones from is found in this episode. Finally, in the last few moments of that episode, Martin is confronted by who else but Breekon and Hope. They hand him a package and then leave. We pick up with that at the end of episode 36. Breekon and Hope delivered 2 things to the archives, one to John specifically, and one to the archive as a whole. The package John received contained a Zippo lighter with a spiderweb design on it that he pockets, and the package delivered to the archive contained what else but the table from episode 3, the one that was last seen with the anglerfish. Let me just say that does not bode well for the archives, but you know, maybe the anglerfish isn't, like, maybe it doesn't follow the table. Finally, both Martin and Rosie, the archive's receptionist, I'm not going to put Rosie on the board, but keep her in mind, Rosie is the archive's receptionist. Both Martin and Rosie described Breekon and Hope in the exact same way. 2 men with thick Cockney accents that looked, quote-unquote, exactly like you'd expect. These 2 gave the exact same description, that these guys look exactly like you'd expect. Like, what are you saying? Come on! Episode 37 doesn't contain any relevant names or information, but it does contain a relevant theme to us. It's all about how this guy, Jason North, breaks a ritual circle in the woods and watches as everything in his life begins to burn. Not much of relevance there, like I said, but the fact that 2 statements in 2 separate places have been so deeply interested in fire is a little concerning. Obviously, the first statement I'm referring to is episode 12, the one where the nurse is trapped in that hospital with Gerard, and that guy who makes vending machines explode. Now we have this guy who breaks a ritual site and watches as everything in his life burns. So what gives? We have 2 separate incidents with literally nothing connecting them other than fire and things being destroyed. At this point, we don't really know what the connection is, but keep it in mind. Episode 38 is the beginning of the end for season 1. That being said, it doesn't involve much relevant information other than another mention of Mikaele Salesa, who was that curios guy we mentioned earlier, or we might not have mentioned. Like I said, this shit is getting complicated. The most important part of this episode is at the very end. Just as John finishes the statement, a spider appears next to him. He crushes it, but in doing so knocks the bookcase over. Sasha comes in to check on John, and the 2 of them find a hole in the wall. As they look into it, a flood of worms begins to pour out as John yells for Sasha to run. Episode 39 is a collection of recordings that give a play-by-play of Jane Prentiss's attack on the Magnus Institute. It begins where we left off as Sasha and John panic as flesh worms pour from the wall. John is staying behind like an idiot in an attempt to grab the tape recorder he was just using as Sasha shouts at him to run. Just as John reaches it, the tape recorder clicks off. We cut to the safe room as Sasha removes a worm from John. Martin's there with him and has a small array of items which John asks him about. Martin explains that he's been worried about a worm invasion for a while, and John thanks him for his diligence before they all relax. secure in the thought that the safe room is indeed safe. As they're talking, we get an interesting tidbit. Firstly, while John appears dismissive, he does believe many of the statements have some substance to them, as the more quote-unquote real statements do not record digitally and can only be recorded on analog tech. This is very interesting indeed, since it heavily implies that the statements and the archives themselves are in some way supernatural. We cut again as Martin spots Tim outside the hallway, very much in range of the worms and seemingly oblivious. Sasha runs out of the safe room and tackles Tim like a badass to warn him about the worms. From there, Sasha runs off, presumably to get help, and Tim runs into the room with the worms where John just was. We get even more evidence that the archives are supernatural as John tells Martin that he feels a presence watching him as he records the statement, and that he doesn't want the presence to know that he believes most of the statements. He fears it. Looking out, Martin sees Jane Prentiss destroying a box of tape recorders, presumably by vomiting worms into them. John asks Martin why he hasn't quit the archives yet, and Martin tells him that he feels trapped somehow. John feels the same way, and the tape recorder clicks off. The recording clicks back on in Elias's office as Sasha approaches him, telling him that the attack has begun. Elias, under John's advice, had the sprinkler system replaced with CO2, but it hasn't been activated since there doesn't seem to be any actual fire. Even though activating the system may kill John and Martin, both Elias and Sasha agree that death is probably preferable to becoming a worm creature. They both dash off to activate the system manually as the recording clicks off. The recording clicks back on with Sasha after she and Elias were separated in artifact storage. She's recording for John since he's into that, and she talks about her experience at the archives working in artifact storage. As she walks deeper in, she comes across the table that was mentioned earlier. As she looks over it, she notices someone else in the room. She calls out to them before a strange noise cuts her off, and she screams. After the scream ends, Sasha repeats the words she just said, and the recorder cuts off. We cut to John and Tim walking through the archives after getting separated from Martin. They find a trapdoor that leads back to the archives, and it opens as it reveals an uncountable number of worms and Jane Prentiss, who calls out to them. At the end of episode 39, and we pick right back up with episode 40. Now, the events that happen next are not presented in chronological order, so forgive me if I get something wrong here. As the trapdoor is opened, hundreds of worms burrow themselves into Tim and John's bodies. Right as this is happening, Elias is able to activate the CO2 system, killing the worms burrowing into Tim and John, and finally killing Jane Prentiss. After this happened, he retreated to the front of the building and waited for the others to regroup. Martin, as the system is going off, is running through the buildings trying to find John and Tim. As he's running, he sees a room slightly hidden off to the side. And inside that room is the dead body of Gertrude Robinson, shot 3 times in the chest. Martin returns to the entrance to tell Elias as Sasha finds John and Tim, removing the worms from their bodies and essentially saving their lives. Sasha returns to the entrance with John and Tim as the 3 get checked out for infection. Sasha mentions that Elias quote-unquote gave her an odd look as she returned, though she doesn't elaborate on that. Finally, a number of things happen in the confusion. The case files for episode 24, 26, and 38 are gone. Martin mentions that, while searching the tunnels for a way out, he came across a room where a group of worms had gathered and formed into either a ring or a door. Martin killed them with CO2 and just moved on. During the statement Elias gives, John demands to know what happened to Gertrude Robinson. Elias tells him that on March 15th he entered her office to find that her desk was covered in a gallon of her blood with no sign of her body. As she had no assistants and the police could find no body, Elias presumed she was dead and hired John as her replacement. That being said, Gertrude's death was not supernatural. She was shot 3 times in the chest. We have to assume here that since Gertrude was initially shot and bled in her office before making it deep into the tunnels, someone within the archives not only shot her but also cleaned up most of her blood to remove the trail that would inevitably form as she limped through the tunnels. Meaning, someone presently within the archives killed Gertrude Robinson. Anyway, we can remove Jane Prentiss from the board. I am glad. I did not really like her or her worms, but we are done with season 1, so we'll go over the evidence in a second. Before we do, so just a brief overview of what happened in season 1. We met our main cast: John, Martin, Sasha, Tim, and Elias, I guess, and we watched as they were terrorized by supernatural creatures. I have here in brackets mainly worms, for 40 episodes. In that time we were also introduced to Jürgen Leitner, a man who seems to have put his name to a number of supernatural books. Whether he's creating these books or collecting them or whether he's even real at this point is unclear, although I do definitely think he is real. We've established the existence of a few supernatural entities, namely Micheal, Jane Prentiss, and the Anglerfish, and we've had a few run-ins with supernatural entities. We've also been introduced to a few cults, and although they aren't really making any moves right now, I'm sure they'll become relevant in the following seasons. Past the plot summary, I just want to say this season was great horror-wise. We had some really incredible episodes, like Lost John's Cave, which was one that we didn't cover but was really, really good. And some really chilling moments as well. There was also a lot of really great sound design. We're going to go over the best moments of sound design later in this video, namely episodes 101, 160. If you know about those, you know. For now, the best thing I can really say about the sound design in this season was that it was great, but that the best is yet to come. Let me give you my thoughts as to who I think killed Gertrude. First off, I think Martin is innocent. If he killed Gertrude, why in the world would he reveal her body to the police when he could just keep it a secret and move on? Gertrude's body was well hidden, so the chances of either John or Tim finding the body as Martin walked past it would be close to none. Secondly, I also think John is innocent. This is a little bit meta, but considering that he's A, the protagonist, and B, completely bewildered by what happened to Gertrude Robinson and all the statements he's mentioned her, makes me think he probably wasn't involved. Also, there's frankly no reason for him to pretend to not know what happened to Gertrude if he actually killed her when there's nobody around. We're also going to remove Rosie from the running since she's barely a named character, which means we finally have Tim, Sasha, and Elias. Out of the three of them, my money is on Elias. He's been here the longest, he's the head of the archives, and he presumably has the greatest knowledge of the tunnels, considering how long he's worked there. Right now we have no proof of that, but I'm gonna stick Elias as the culprit and just mark that down on the board real quick. Now that that's over, I think a re-examination of the board as a whole is a good idea. First things first, let's examine some of the themes we've seen throughout the series thus far. 1, we've got fake people and things resembling humans. 2, we've got being watched. 3, we've got books. 4, we've got things that slither and sickness. 5, we've got fire. 6, we've got spiders. 7, we've got darkness. 8, we've got hunting. 9, we've got being alone. And 10, we've got meat and bones. So we can immediately see a few things just by looking at this. Firstly, fake people and things that slither are overwhelmingly present throughout the series thus far, and at present, the only themes that we have confirmed supernatural entities within them. And for the sake of it, I'm going to add the entities associated with the theme around them. So fake people are the most prevalent currently, and most other themes have about one associated creature or person. The main creature we had for slithering was Jane Prentiss, and she is dead at this point. We're going to keep this new board for themes around and just kind of give it a little tidy since it seems like it'll probably be relevant for us. That being said, I feel very comfortable asserting that what we'll call the Hive will come back. I really struggle to believe that it died alongside Prentiss, so we'll just leave it on the board. I'm going to mark down the fake people space as the other, and I just want to note that the other doesn't seem to be controlled via a hive mind like, you know, the Hive, since the Anglerfish and Micheal seem to have very different goals. Now let's discuss the Lightless Flame and the Beholding. There's only been one mention of the two of them, and we have very little evidence to tie them to any other statements. Despite that, I am going to put both of them up on the board since it feels like they're going to be relevant later on. You can throw things at me if you want, but it feels like they're going to be relevant. The People's Church of the Divine Host seems to be sort of tied to darkness and the fear associated with it, and they seem to be kind of associated with the beast that hunts in darkness, and as such we'll put them on the board as well. There are a few themes here that don't have much that can be tied to them. Spiders, books, hunting, stuff like that, but I am going to keep them around and just leave them there despite that. So we've got a very loose idea of the players in the game. Let's just take it in for a minute before we move on to Season 2. We start Season 2 in almost the same spot we ended Season 1 in. John has begun venturing into the tunnels under the archives. He was able to get the key for the trapdoor from Elias's desk and has been exploring. He was able to find a lot of dead worms with footsteps tracing a path through the middle, suggesting that someone else had also been down there. He also found those worms in the shape of a door that Martin talked about, but that's besides the point. John considers the tunnels that he's walking through. It's said that they were once Millbank Prison, a prison proposed and designed as a panopticon, a circular prison that went stories up, in the middle of which would be a large guard tower. The idea was that prisoners would never attempt escape, as they could be being watched at any one moment. That being said, it didn't turn out that way. Robert Smirke was brought in to finish the project in 1815, finishing it 6 years later. Smirke's design was similar to the original, but much more labyrinthine. It was closed in 1890 and demolished shortly after, becoming the tunnels under the archive. Eventually, John discovered a set of stairs that led up into a wall and further down. Before descending, he decided to explore the floor that he was on, but shortly after deciding that, came upon another staircase, this one with an arrow pointing down. Following it, he came upon a straight corridor with a wine bottle from 2003 nearby. He stepped back and bumped into the wall behind him. The walls began to shift and press in on him, and he heard one word: leave. He ends the statement by saying that whatever's in the tunnels is his primary concern. Next comes the supplemental, which is a new addition to Season 2's structure. The supplementals occur after the statement and are recorded on John's personal recorder, meaning they won't be accessible by anyone but him. John admits that while he does want to find whatever's in the tunnels, his main concern is actually Gertrude's death. John also believes that Elias probably killed Gertrude, but is convinced it could potentially be any of his colleagues. Because of that, he's overstating his interest in the tunnels in the hopes that his colleagues will lower their guards. Episode 42 isn't terribly relevant, but it does end with John stating in the supplemental that he's wary of Martin, who's quote-unquote been very attentive post John's return to work. Like I said, I don't suspect Martin in the slightest, but it doesn't seem like John's quite there yet. Episode 43 is very relevant though. It introduces Miss Basira Hussain, a police constable who's been sent to the archives to investigate Gertrude's death. Basira is our narrator for this section, and she'll appear quite prominently this season, so we'll stick her just below the archives. This episode is about Basira's signing of a Section 31 form, a section of the Freedom of Information Act, essentially preventing civilians from accessing police testimony should it be deemed relevant to an investigation. It's essentially the police's excuse not to release evidence of supernatural encounters to the public, which the police seem to deal with quite frequently. Basira's the second in command for the section department, just below Daisy Tonner, a sectioned detective who we'll hear from later in the season. We'll put her on the board next to Basira. Basira's first section came after arresting a man named Diego Molina, who was actually the chanting man from episode 12. He was in this altercation with Gerard Keay and was found chanting some stuff about cleansing fire in a sark. The man seemed to be able to make the handcuffs supernatural hot, and, as a final act, whispered something into the ear of Basira's previous partner that made him burn himself to death later that day. Basira had only had 2 other sectioned cases, one of which we won't talk about, and the other being the Prentiss incident that occurred at the end of season 1. Basira did, at the end of the episode, mention that Daisy had had many more sectioned cases than her, and at one point had mentioned vampires. Lots of groundwork stuff here, and while I'm not going to put vampires down as confirmed entities just yet, it's definitely on the docket. John also mentions in the supplemental that Basira said she would get him some tapes found on Gertrude's body so that he could further investigate Gertrude's death, and also because the tape recorder at the precinct didn't actually work. Episode 44 has a bunch of relevant information, so we'll go over it quickly. First off, it's given by Gertrude Robinson, who, fun fact, is voiced by Jonathan Sims' mother. This is so fucked. So the main character that we follow is called Jonathan Sims, and that's our main character, and the guy who voices him and also is one of the creators of the podcast is also named Jonathan Sims. We're not going to talk about the real Jonathan Sims too much, but yeah, the mother of the real Jonathan Sims voices Gertrude, so that's cool, I guess. The statement follows a child going to a Russian circus run by a man named Gerard Orsinov, who we heard about in episode 24. The calliope from that episode also reappears in this one, confirming that a circus did own it at some point. Anyway, at one point the brother of the man went missing, and determined to find the brother, he made his way behind the tent where he found what seemed to be a taxidermied tiger that was somehow alive. After finding the tiger, he was carried back to his father by 2 men in overalls who spoke in crude Russian and whose words flowed back and forth. The description given in the episode is almost an exact match of Breekon and Hope, the sole difference being that they were speaking Russian instead of English. Gertrude ends the recording by saying that she believes the residents of the town got off quite lucky, as Gerard Orsinov's troop was particularly dangerous at that time, and John's supplemental doesn't contain any relevant information. Breekon and Hope have been alive for at least 80 years and have clearly not aged a day. They are 100% supernatural in some way. Maybe they're using supernatural beauty cream, I don't fucking know. I also feel quite comfortable tying them to considering the finer details of the statement, including the taxidermied tiger. We're going to count Breekon and Hope as one unit here, which means that we now have, by my count, 3 supernatural entities that still live, all of which are related to the other. That makes me a little nervous. Episode 45 includes a mention of Mikaele Salesa and ends with John pondering why Tim actually works at the archives in the supplemental, since Tim studied anthropology and worked at a publishing house for 5 years before beginning work at the archives. Episode 46 includes another mention of Micheal Crew, and outright states that he at one point owned Altiora before Gerard Keay burned it in 2012. The supplemental is John stating that the trapdoor to the tunnels had been opened, and though his colleagues all denied going down, he suspects that one of them had opened it. Episode 47 is one of the most consequential in the entire of the show, so we're going to talk about it in some detail. It's the account of Helen Richardson, a realtor who sells expensive houses in Wimbledon. She was doing viewings one day before, at the end of the day, a tall man with straw-coloured hair arrived. He introduced himself, and although Helen forgot his name, we will find out that this was Micheal, the same Micheal that reached into Sasha's arm. As she showed Micheal around the house, she noticed a new door, one in a seemingly impossible spot that should have led to nowhere. Instead, it led into a long corridor, seemingly lasting forever. As Helen stepped in, the new door closed behind her and disappeared, sealing her inside. She wandered the halls for days before she saw a figure. While its form resembled that of a human's, it was clearly something else. It stalked behind her as she ran through the impossible hallways, turning right over and over and never looping. Eventually she found a mirror and, breaking through it, found herself in Dulwich. She recovered and went to the Institute to make her statement. John believes her and confirms that the man's name was Micheal. Sasha enters and confirms to John that there are no new details to add to her statement about Micheal, which was one of the few statements that went missing during the attack. As Sasha leaves, a figure appears, the tape recording being increasingly distorted. The figure is Micheal. He tells John that he's being lied to, and when questioned as to why he's there, tells John that he's there to collect something he lost. Helen. John laughs, telling Micheal that she just left, and Micheal laughs in turn because the door she left through was not there when she entered. John demands to know who Micheal is, and Micheal tells him that he's not a who but a what. Micheal tells John that the reason he intervened to help the archives is because there is a war raging, and losing the archives would ruin the power balance. Then Micheal leaves. This confirms a suspicion I've had since the original Micheal statement. Whatever these supernatural entities or groups are, they are not friendly with one another, and John, and the archives as a whole, are involved in that power struggle whether they want to be or not. That tells me Elias probably knows a lot more about this power struggle than he's letting on. Episode 48 isn't relevant, though it does include a meeting between Elias and John in the supplemental, where Elias states that Tim and Sasha are uncomfortable with John's presence as he's been spying on them in his off time. John's been taking the search for who killed Gertrude very seriously, so much so that it's quickly deteriorating his personal relationships. Episode 49 features Jared Hopsworth quite heavily. He seems to have found a job working for the mob, disposing of bodies into a meat hole. That is not a joke nor a euphemism, it's a hole full of meat that you toss meat into. That's not funny at all. That was until Jared was caught. He's now at large. The supplemental includes John's investigation of Elias, who, and I'm not joking, went to the same school as me at one point. Like, he also lived in Oxford, and he also went to the same school that I went to. What's even more fucked up than that is that I knew a guy named Elias while I went there. This shit's freaky, man. Anyway, Elias's life seems to have turned very quickly and abruptly when he went into the archives for seemingly little reason and became its head 5 years later. A bit odd, but not relevant as to whether Elias killed Gertrude or not. Episode 50 features Robert Smirk quite heavily, and John notes that Smirk seems to have only ever created supernatural architecture. Seriously, pretty much all of his buildings are hotspots for hauntings or, ghouls. Episode 51 is quite interesting. It's from the perspective of a diver named Andrea. She went out to sea with Simon Fairchild to get heirlooms from his grandfather's yacht, and before she went down to dive, Fairchild said something to her, and minutes later, she found herself entering into a seemingly infinite space through a gap in a ship. A creature so massive that its hand took up her entire field of vision was beneath the ship, and she froze in fear, eventually coming back to herself with a jolt of pain. She surfaced and narrowly survived decompression sickness. She talks to a captain who strongly implies that Fairchild died on that expedition with him, though, to be honest, I don't really believe that. This is interesting though. Simon Fairchild has made another appearance, and again, He said something to a person and they found themselves trapped in an endless expanse. The creature in 51 does remind me of the one described in Ex Altiora, all the way back in episode 5, I believe, but there is little to connect Ex Altiora to Fairchild past that. I think it's fair to say that Simon Fairchild is in some way supernatural, so I'm going to stick him up on the board. The supplemental is interesting too. John had a conversation with Sasha earlier that morning, which he managed to record. He saw her staring at the table in artifact storage, and they had a brief conversation where Sasha described the pattern more as a web than a fractal. After John implies that the anglerfish was caught within the web, Sasha comments that the creature doesn't sound like it wants to be bound to the table. John also says that he's seen Sasha visiting Madame Tussauds wax museum on her lunch breaks. That was really odd, right? Sasha saying that the anglerfish wouldn't like being bound to the table pretty much came out of nowhere. Let's re-examine Sasha's recent actions. Near the end of episode 39, she saw a figure coming out of the corner of artifact storage, called out to it, and screamed. She stopped screaming soon after and repeated the words she'd just said, slowly and deliberately. Since then, several people have given her strange looks or made comments about how she quote-unquote seems frazzled. Are you picking up what I'm putting down? I believe Sasha was killed by the anglerfish at the end of episode 39, and the anglerfish has assumed her identity. That's why people keep giving her weird looks and making comments about how she seems off. That's why she's acting weirdly and making offhand comments about how the anglerfish is bound to the table. It's because she's not Sasha. There is a key detail about the anglerfish you may have forgotten, and that is when the anglerfish takes over someone's identity, it erases most pieces of evidence of their identity's previous life. It changes most photos they're in, especially digital ones, changes previous identifying documents, and so on and so forth. Crucially though, the last time we saw the anglerfish take someone's identity, there was a person who remembered the past self that was taken. That was Amy Patel in episode 3, and there's a chance that there's someone out there who knew the past Sasha and does not know the fake one in the archives right now. Also, perhaps even more interesting than that is that the person who potentially remembers her might be Elias. The first thing fake Sasha says in episode 40 is that Elias, quote-unquote, gave her an odd look. That's the strongest sign we've seen of a lack of recognition thus far. That being said, if Elias does know that this Sasha is fake, why has he not said anything? I mean, surely the anglerfish being in the archives is not a good thing. There are a lot of questions at hand right now, but the most we can do is just mark down that Sasha's passed on. Anyway, episode 52. This one is very relevant. It's written by one of the prison guards of Robert Montauk, the serial killer from episode 9. The guard sees a few things of note, one of which is a clearly blind man, who we find out later in the episode is Maxwell Rayner, who visits Montauk. They stare at each other, clearly despising one another, before the light bulb blows and Rayner says, quote-unquote, "You didn't think you could kill it for long, did you?" The second thing of note came 8 months later, the day of Montauk's death. The power went off in the wing Montauk was in, and the guards checked on each prisoner until they reached Montauk. Darkness billowed from the cell, and this growling creature was besides them. The lights then flickered on before anything could happen to the guards, but at that point it was too late. Montauk was already dead. He had been stabbed to death. So, this statement takes place in 2002, 8 years after the dissolution of the People's Church of the Divine Host, meaning we can confirm Rayner is still alive and active, meaning he's also probably still in charge of the church. Now, the really important bit, the beast is real. The creature that stalked Robert Montauk in episode 9 and killed him in 52 is confirmed to be real. The beast also seems to have been killed by Montauk, temporarily obviously, but that is massive. The archives have some form of protection should the beast come knocking. So that form of protection is human sacrifice. Either way, I'm putting Rayner and the beast down on the board and moving Micheal next to the anglerfish, because I just realized I never did that. Episode 53 pretty much confirms the existence of previous archives throughout history. It also implies heavily that the Library of Alexandria was one of those archives, but past that, it doesn't have much relevant information. Episode 54 is more relevant to us though. It follows a tax inspector looking over a taxidermy shop in Barnett. The shop is run by who else but Daniel Rawlings, who was one of the missing people from all the way back in episode 1. The taxidermied animals are of course somewhat alive, and Breekon and Hope make an appearance later in the episode. What's more interesting is that Sasha goes to conduct a follow-up interview with Rawlings despite John's hesitancy, and when she performs that interview she finds absolutely nothing. There's good evidence given in the episode to suggest that the Rawlings of the store is the same Rawlings that disappeared in episode 1, but she doesn't report any of that. I'm fully convinced now that Sasha is the anglerfish. I'm going to move her down to the creature area. Episode 55 doesn't contain much relevant information besides confirmation of Prentiss's death. Episode 56 is the second part of Trevor Herbert's statement confirming that he did, in fact, not die. It's a good sign. I mean, Trevor is pretty much the only person we can confirm to be hunting supernatural entities like vampires. He does also mention that the last entity he encountered was a woman filled with spiders who seemed to have unreasonable powers of suggestion, but that's more of a side note in the episode than anything else. John and Martin have a good conversation in the supplemental, and John finally drops his suspicion of Martin. That is another good sign. John can now be sure that he has someone in his corner. Episode 57 is one of the best pieces of horror media ever made, so I won't spoil any of it, other than to say the Fairchilds and Lucas family are mentioned in the post-statement, along with another mention of Nialasund. Episode 58 isn't particularly relevant, but for the fact that it seems nigh impossible for the statement to have ended up in the archives in the first place. John manages to catch Tim and Martin discussing how they need to intervene in the supplemental, and he expresses how suspicious he is of Tim. Let me get real, I'm personally not with John on this one. I think that it's almost guaranteed Elias killed Gertrude, considering how suspicious his origins are, and how he seemed to notice that Sasha was the anglerfish, and then decided not to mention that to the others. Tim is one of the few allies that John definitely has within the archives, and I'm not happy to see that their relationship is clearly taking a downturn. Episode 59 is another one about Hilltop Road and Raymond Fielding. We won't go over it too heavily, but I will say that the person writing the statement mentions a feeling of intense heat being associated with Agnes Montague, and the statement heavily features spiders. All I'll say on the statement of episode 60 is that it features a woman feeling like she's being watched. The supplemental is important though. It's the rest of the cast giving John an intervention. They're upset by how he clearly trusts none of them and the fact that he's been stalking them in his downtime. The intervention culminates with Elias giving John the recently released footage of the week of Gertrude's murder. The room she was in was not recorded, but the footage is enough to give all of our characters an alibi. None of them can be seen entering the archives where they'd go on to kill Gertrude. Look, you may think this is disqualifying to my theory that Elias killed Gertrude, but it's not. The trapdoor to the tunnels was not recorded, and the archives, and thus Gertrude, can be accessed via them. If anything, it strengthens my point, since the only person who had access to the key for the tunnels at that point was Elias, meaning that he's still the prime suspect. Episode 61 is the statement of Daisy Tonner, Basira's partner and a sectioned detective. In the first moments of the episode, she tells John that he was the prime suspect for Gertrude's murder, but the footage exonerated him. Despite being very reluctant at first, she eventually agrees to give her statement on the incident that initially got her sectioned. She was watching the highway when she noticed a van going 25. She and her partner had enough cause to stop them, and since they were generally violent people, they did so. The van was owned by Breekon and Hope, and as they pulled the van over, they heard banging coming from the back. Daisy and her partner got the man to open the boot, and inside was a coffin. They got the man to open it, and it revealed a staircase within the coffin. Daisy's partner, despite her protesting, went down the staircase and was never seen again. Daisy confirms after the statement that vampires are, in fact, real. Trevor's description was exactly confirmed, meaning that he is almost certainly an actual hunter of the supernatural. I'm going to add vampires to the board. Episode 62 is a big one. It's a statement from Mary Keay herself, taken by Gertrude Robinson in 2008. Mary confirms a few things here. 1, she met Jürgen Leitner. 2, she owned several Leitner books, even owning a few before they were even called Leitners. And 3, she talks about her own Leitner, which was a book able to bind souls within its pages. At the end of the episode, Gertrude asks who the book is from, and Mary replies, quote, "From the end, of course." She also says that she, quote, "could not serve it, as she found a single devotion too restrictive." John pops in the supplemental to mention that he's found Gertrude's laptop and a key, both stored in a floorboards in the archives. Let's address the biggest revelation in this episode. There is probably another cult. Mary Keay calls at the end, and the only thing we can really confirm about it is that it made this book, which is able to bind souls. We can't confirm any members or anything like that, but it did exist, at least in 2008. Since we don't have any confirmed members, we aren't going to put it on the board just yet, though we are going to put the soul-binding Leitner up on the objects board. Episode 63 mentions Robert Smuck, and we see Melanie King again. She tells John that, quote, "the new girl let her in," and she asks for access to the archives library. John tells her that he'll get Sasha to let her in, and I will note that there has been no mention of a, quote, new girl past this episode. We're going to skip over episodes 64, 65, and 66, other than to say John and Tim have an argument at the end of 65 and seem to be on slightly better terms after it, and John manages to unlock Gertrude's laptop that same episode. Episode 66 features Salesa quite prominently, and Peter Lucas makes a minor appearance at the end, suggesting that Salesa is a lot more involved in the supernatural element of the world than we had necessarily suspected. John also discovers that Gertrude took a lot of trips and bought a lot of strange stuff: lighter fluid, pesticides, high-power torches, and finally, some Lightners. I'm going to add Mikaele Salesa to the board since he's popping up quite frequently at the moment. Episode 67 is quite interesting. It's a recounting of Jack Barnabas, a man who was in a brief relationship with Agnes Montague between October and November of 2006. During that time, Agnes acted quite strange and, in Jack's words, relished small, novel actions. Agnes asked Jack in that time if he felt he had a destiny, and when Jack said no, she told him that must be nice. Their final date was November 3rd, 2006. Agnes suddenly clutched her chest while walking, and they made her way to a payphone, calling somebody and saying something about a tree falling and finishing something. Jack walked her to her apartment, and with a real sense of finality, she said goodbye to him. He asked her for a kiss, and she obliged. The kiss then burned his face irreparably. Agnes died that same day. John is able to confirm in the post-statement that Agnes visited the cafe Jack worked for a decade without aging a single day. So between Agnes growing up in Hilltop Road, which is at this point a clearly supernatural place, and being able to burn people beyond belief seemingly without wanting to, I think it's safe to say that she's also probably supernatural, most likely in a similar way to Simon Fairchild. I also think it's safe to say that Agnes is probably associated with the cult of the Lightless Flame, considering several people associated with the cult are mentioned at the end of the statement. Because of that, I'm going to put her up on the themes board along with the cult. Probably shouldn't be up there since she's dead, but since the cult doesn't have any representatives right now, I'm just going to leave her up there. Episode 68 isn't massively relevant, but it does contain another Leitner, though it was burnt shortly after the statement was given in 2003, and it mentions a Private Amherst, who in the book acts as a harbinger of death and disease. John mentions that the Private Amherst of the book is probably the same John Amherst that exists today, who was mentioned back in Statement 32, and I can't remember if I mentioned him there. Like I said, this shit's getting complicated. This Private Amherst is probably the same as the John Amherst who exists today, and to be honest, I agree with him. So, the supplemental is John getting lost in the tunnels, and as he's beginning to get worried, who else appears to save him than Sasha herself? John mentions that for a moment she seemed far too tall. Look, there isn't definite proof that Sasha is the anglerfish, but I mean, fucking come on, dude. If you're still skeptical after that, like, what can I even say? I mean, the supplemental was recorded past the closing hours of the archives, and yet Sasha is still there, and what's more, she looked inhuman in the dark of the tunnels. I do wonder why the anglerfish isn't just killing John here, though. He still clearly doesn't trust her, and he's likely to find out that she isn't actually Sasha eventually. John is alone and defenseless at this point, and she could hide John in the tunnels with near certainty that his body would never be found. And it's not like she can't kill people. She killed Sasha at the end of episode 39. So what gives? Maybe it's got something to do with the table. I don't really know though. Episode 69, nice, is about a failed psychology experiment. It was essentially an ESP experiment, which is related to telepathy, where they would play footage of spiders to a room of arachnophobes and watch the reaction of a person on the other side of the wall. The person on the other side was named Annabelle Cane, and she eventually became a spider person toward the end of the experiment. Sadly, it would seem she was passed up for a cameo in the last Spider-Verse movie. Tragic. I know. Anyway, I bring up the episode because of how spiders have been characterized thus far on the show. Despite the fact that they are insects, they've been portrayed as very much separate to the hive, where the hive is more focused on the horrors of insects, disease, and things that squirm. Spiders, and the statements that have mentioned them, have more been focused on being manipulated or entombed. Episode 69, nice, mentions that Annabelle seemed to be controlling the arachnophobes via strings, and episode 59 mentioned Raymond Fielding encasing people in web cocoons. I think this is particularly relevant because of how many times spiders have come up. If there were only one or two statements that heavily featured spiders and themes of manipulation, I'd be willing to leave the theme alone, but it's been seen so much that I have to wonder if there's something more going on here. Episode 70 features another Leitner, though its location or continued existence is unverifiable. Still, we're at like 5 or 6 Lightners at this point, and we have learned nothing about the man himself or the incident that happened at his library that John has mentioned a few times now. Episode 71 is a funny one. It's given firsthand by Karolina Gorka and is her recounting her experience of getting on a train that somehow, without warning or indication, found itself entirely buried underground, and she managed to get out of this alive by, this is not a joke, falling asleep. Wild. Episode 72 features a Sweeney Todd reference, and that's the most I'll say about it. Episode 73 has a lot of important information, so let's go over it quickly. Episode 73 has a lot of important information, so let's go over it quickly. It's a recounting of a police raid on a warehouse owned by Outer Bay Shipping and inhabited by Maxwell Rayner and the People's Church of the Divine Host. Basira was brought in as part of a section task force and sought John's advice on how best to deal with the church before the episode starts. The task force was assembled to retrieve a child taken by Maxwell Rayner named Callum Brody, though nobody seems to understand exactly why Rayner and the church took him. The operation was largely successful, and Basira was able to catch Rayner in the middle of expelling some sort of black mist from his mouth into the mouth of Callum Brody. He's shot on the spot, and Brody is retrieved safe. Natalie Ennis of episode 25 fame is killed in the episode 2, and right at the episode, Basira quits the police force. So that's it. Maxwell Rayner is dead, and the People's Church of the Divine Host probably dies with him. Feels a little underwhelming, but I suppose let's remove them from the board. John also notes that Rayner was able to avoid the police for 20 years, and he's confused as to how they were able to find him all of a sudden, especially considering Basira had no idea either. I do think this is a little odd, but whatever. Episode 74 features another mention of Micheal, though he's in somebody's dreams this time. The real meat of this episode is the supplemental, though. John buys some motion-sensing cameras to record the trapdoor to the tunnels, and he sees Sasha entering the tunnels on 2 separate occasions, indicating that she's been lying to him. That's not a shock to us. What is a shock to us is the mention of a middle-aged man who entered the room with the trapdoor at 3 AM and instead of going through the trapdoor again, shifted the floor itself to get down into the tunnels. And this middle-aged guy is not Elias. So there are a few possibilities as to who this middle-aged guy is. The first possibility is that he's unnamed right now, but that feels quite unsatisfying, especially for a show as detail-oriented as the Magnus Archives. The second is that he's Jürgen Leitner. We don't know if Leitner is dead or alive at this point, and considering this man seems to have some sort of supernatural powers, it seems fair to say it could be him, since he was an aficionado of supernatural books. Finally, it could be Gerard Keay. Gerard would, at this point, be around middle-aged, and his mother was able to cheat death at some point. Gerard's also associated with the archives and was collecting Lightners, meaning he would have access to supernatural abilities. Gerard's also associated with the archives and was at one point collecting Lightners, meaning he would have access to supernatural abilities. Right now, it's too early to say who this guy is, but I'm sure we'll find out soon. I'm also going to move Sasha / the Anglerfish to the middle of the board since a confrontation seems to be coming. Episode 75 features another mention of Michael Crew and is one of the most stomach-churning episodes yet, but the statement doesn't have much new information to offer us. Basira does show up in the post-statement though. She's pissed off that the police are covering up what happened with Callum Brody, and she's brought the remaining Gertrude tapes the police had as a form of payback. She tells John that she's truly done with the supernatural from now on. Episode 76 is another statement from Melanie King. It goes over the event she came to the archives to study on and doesn't contain much of note. What is of note is the post-statement section. Melanie's going to India to continue her research and becomes deeply upset when John tells her that Sasha, the anglerfish that is the same person as the Sasha she met initially before the anglerfish got her. Melanie leaves quite angrily. This is interesting. Firstly, John's trust in Sasha is reaching a breaking point and he's beginning to suspect that she may not be who she says she is. That's great. What's unsettling to me here is the implication that unless more than one person can notice that the anglerfish has taken over somebody's life, I see no way that Elias could have possibly known that Sasha was the anglerfish, and thus I see no reason for him to give her that initial odd glance. The most obvious explanation here is that more than one person can witness the anglerfish's transformation, but if that's not the case, how did Elias know? We know that he's not being honest with us, and I mean, I think it may be time to start considering the possibility that Elias may be some sort of supernatural entity himself. Episode 77 is the beginning of the end of Season 2. John has been going through the box labeled Changeling/Imposter that Basira gave him. It's full of tapes on a creature that matches the description of the anglerfish. And at the end of episode 77, the person giving the account notes that the only pieces of information she had found of the person whose life was taken over were recordings. John notes that the statements that went missing at the end of season 1 all had one thing in common, which was that they featured Sasha's voice. They were the only tapes in the archives that went missing. Episode 78 follows up on that. It features the anglerfish taking over the life of a man's cousin. Midway through the episode, a man named Adelard Decker appears, introducing himself as an exorcist of sorts. The man manages to bind the anglerfish to the table, and Breekon and Hope carry the table out the day after. In the post-statement, John deduces that the anglerfish is tied to the table and, as a final piece of proof, is able to find the tapes that went missing. Where else but Sasha's desk? He now knows for certain that the anglerfish took Sasha. John tells Martin and Tim to take the next few days off before he makes his way to artifact storage with an axe. It would seem it's remarkably easy to buy an axe in central London. John raises the axe above his head and destroys the table entirely. It's hollow, filled with only cobwebs and dust. Micheal appears in the room with a laugh and tells John that he just made a massive mistake. The anglerfish is free and he will not be able to escape it. As it calls out to John, Micheal offers him an out, a door to walk through. Episode 79, we cut to Martin and Tim, who decided not to leave after John told them to. They enter into John's office to find that he's not there. Worried, they grab a tape recorder and start recording before they run into the anglerfish, which doesn't notice them, heading deeper into the tunnels. Martin remarks that it looks like Sasha, and Tim chastises him before Martin eventually steals his resolve and heads into the tunnels after it, which forces Tim to follow. We cut to John, furious with himself for taking Michael's offer instead of confronting the creature. Michael's door led him to somewhere in the tunnels, and not knowing where he is, he's decided to wait. As he says that into the tape recorder, he hears the anglerfish calling out to him in Sasha's voice. It is nearby. Martin and Tim are in the tunnels searching for John. Tim's anxious to find him, but realizes they probably won't be able to find him themselves. He says that they should go get Elias, but Martin refuses to leave the tunnels, and not wanting to leave him, Tim stays, though they get into an argument. Micheal suddenly appears and threatens the two before they flee into one of his doors, finding themselves stuck in one of Michael's endless, distorted hallways. We cut back to John, who's grappling with the fact that Sasha is well and truly gone, and is recording in the hopes that, should the anglerfish take his face, the tape he's recording will provide proof of his past self. The anglerfish calls out to him in its true voice, telling him that it'll take his face as it did with Sasha, and nobody will ever know. John shouts for her to stop, and begins to run as it chases after him. We cut to Tim and Martin, who are still in Michael's hallway. Very little can be made out since the hallway seems to mess with the tape recorder and prevent it from recording properly. We cut back to John, who's been caught by the anglerfish. It mocks him in Sasha's voice, telling him that the clues he uncovered were left by it in the hopes that he would smash the table, and John did just that. She tells John that he's a shadow of his predecessor and remarks that she'll be a better archivist than he ever could be. She considers whether it would be possible to replace him and says that he'd miss the unknowing. While this is happening, John is muttering apologies to Tim, Martin, and Sasha, and by this point the anglerfish finally concludes by saying that taking John's body is unlikely to rob the eye of its pupil, quote-unquote, but that she'll still kill him. As she reels back to do so, we hear stone shifting as the creature screams. John is bewildered as he's approached by the man that shifted stone. He tells John it's time that they talk. Episode 80, Statement of Jürgen Leitner regarding his life and works, recorded direct from subject. Following the banishment of the anglerfish, John is left with his savior, Jürgen Leitner, the man who was living in the tunnels and was seen shifting stone. They have made their way back up to the archives to record the statement, and Leitner begins. He tells John that he's been using a copy of the 7 Lamps of Architecture to shift Robert Smirke's architecture, and a copy of A Disappearance to hide from John's, in Leitner's words, master. Leitner explains that he's been hiding since the destruction of his library in 1994, on the run from the creatures and people who are hunting him. He explains that he was once the scion of a wealthy family and would almost certainly never need to work throughout his life. Because of that, he felt a calling to make something greater of himself. Soon after he first felt that feeling, he encountered the first of his books, the Stalwart Hunter's Almanac, and he hired his first assistant, Albert Stross, who lasted about 15 days before dying. Leitner's collection kept expanding as he found that collecting these books was almost effortless. That being said, keeping certain books close to one another had unexpected results, and so he built a library in accordance with Smirke's architecture. It worked, and at its peak, the library stored nearly 1,000 books. That wouldn't last for long though, as soon after the library was assaulted by supernatural entities of all kinds. It burnt to the ground, and Leitner had been on the run ever since. Leitner goes on to explain his understanding of the entities behind these books. He believes that there are entities like gods themselves, and that these supernatural beings like Micheal and the Anglerfish belong to them. These entities are beyond our comprehension, and the only way to interact with them are through these avatars like Micheal. He tells John that he believes Elias killed Gertrude, who he had been working with, in order to destroy the archives, as he then stole the files relating to their plan. Leitner reveals that Elias serves an entity known as the Beholding, or the Eye. John also serves this creature, though he doesn't fully realize it. John makes perhaps the biggest mistake of his life thus far, and leaves to have a smoke. He's naturally overwhelmed, but as John leaves, Elias, through a side door, enters the room holding a pipe. He's pleased to have discovered who Gertrude was working with, confirming that he did indeed kill Gertrude. Leitner tries to get the files that Elias took from Gertrude, saying they contain everything Gertrude found on stopping the Stranger and the Unknowing. Elias does not care. He kills Jürgen Leitner with the pipe and leaves. John re-enters but flees immediately upon seeing that Leitner is dead. Tim and Martin have by this point escaped Michael's hallway, and they discover Leitner's body. John is the prime suspect. There is a huge amount to break down here, so let's start with the most important stuff first. These things that we've been encountering aren't cults, they're gods. Or some of them are cults, but they serve these gods. What's more, there seems to be a no true heroes sort of narrative, as our main characters serve one of these gods themselves. We're going to convert our themes board to show these gods, and we're getting rid of the book's theme since it feels quite similar to the Beholding. Thus far, I believe we've only gotten 2 of these gods actually named, those being the Stranger and the Beholding, both of which were given to us by Leitner. I think it's probably safe to say that most, if not all of the themes on the board are probably separate gods, which leaves us with 9 in total. This is undoubtedly our biggest development yet, and it will probably remain our biggest development throughout the rest of the show. Our next development is perhaps a little less serious. Elias killed Gertrude and is 100% supernatural. Still, that puts the rest of the cast in a very strange position where they seemingly can't leave and their boss has no regard for their lives. And I mean, what's Elias's end goal here? It hardly seems like he's making any progress toward total world domination here. So I mean, what's the point in doing all of this? And finally, John is being framed for murder by Elias no less, which leaves our cast in a significantly worse position than they were at the end of Season 1, though perhaps the knowledge they've gained has made up for that. Before we go into Season 3, I do just want to put something in the middle of the board. Leitner mentions something called the Unknowing and seems to link it to the Stranger. I don't know what that is, but I know enough about this show to understand that it's going to be relevant. Let's stick it in the middle of the board. Okay, let me give some quick criticisms and a bit of praise for the second season before we move on. I did definitely like the Anglerfish plotline. I thought it was really well set up throughout the season. That being said, it was a bit obvious. On my first listen through of the archives, I listened to the end of episode 40 where, and this is not a joke, a not Sasha is mentioned in the credits. So it's like Martin, Tim, Sasha, not Sasha. It kind of gave the whole plot point away. And then even if I hadn't been spoiled like that, the part in episode 39 where Sasha sees another person and gets got and then repeats what she just said in a different voice was just so obvious. It was so unbelievably obvious. I think what the writers should have done was remove that scene entirely and just switch Sasha's voice actor out without saying anything, and then sprinkle a few clues in throughout the second season to point to there being a mole in the archives. It still would have been 100% possible to discover that Sasha was the mole even with my more minimal interpretation, like looking at the tapes that went missing, 24, 26, and 38. Those are the only ones that had Sasha's voice in them. That definitely points to Sasha being the mole. Even more criticism here, I really don't like the early reveal of these eldritch gods. We're less than halfway through the show and it feels like the central mystery of what's happening has already been revealed. I mean, for a show that's been so thoroughly built on the mystery of what's going on, it feels like there's really nowhere to go from here. Like, we've already revealed the central mystery, what more is there to say? I hope I'm wrong and there are more mysteries to talk about, but, you know, it makes me nervous. Like, I've been criticizing this season a lot, but I do definitely think it was better than Season 1. The plot is losing me a little, but the horror is still there and it's still engaging. If Season 1 was like an 8 out of 10, then I think Season 2 is a 9. My biggest concern here is really where they go from here. Anyway, enough of that, let's get back to the video. Episode 81 is from John. He's hiding out at Georgie's apartment, a friend who Melanie mentioned a couple of times, and he is clearly struggling. He explains to us that his worldview has been pretty much shattered. Leitner, to him, was always an antagonistic figure because of an event from his childhood. He didn't yet realize that Leitner didn't create the books, he just collected them. John now realizes that not only was his perspective entirely wrong, but because of that he's been fooled into working for and with a monster. John recounts the event that introduced him to the supernatural and Leitner's as a whole. Though he's now been claimed by the Eye, his first encounter was with another entity entirely, one who we've not yet heard of, the Web, or in John's words, the Spider. So that answers another question we've been stewing on in the back of our minds for a while now, the matter of spiders. They aren't related to the Hive, they're an entirely separate entity. John continues by recounting an experience that he had when he was a child. He found a Leitner, a book called A Guest for Mr. Spider, that took control of him and forced him to walk to the eponymous Mr. Spider's house so that he could then be eaten. The only reason he didn't die was because John's bully chose to take the book off him, and so in turn, John was saved. John then watched this bully jankily walk up to Mr. Spider's door before he knocked, revealing strings attached to his limbs, was then dragged inside and never seen again. So there's a convergence of themes happening here that leads me to a very interesting conclusion. For starters, John was initially marked by the Web, not the Eye, meaning that he may actually be working for the Web right now. This idea is reinforced by the fact that the Web seems to be concerned with manipulation, puppeteering, and things of that nature, and then reinforced even further by the fact that John is currently in possession of a lighter with a spiderweb design on it, delivered right to him by Breekon and Hope. I'm going to make a big prediction here the same way I did last season. I'm pretty sure John is actually working for the Web, not the Eye. That being said, I don't think John knows that. I think he truly believes that he's working for the Eye and is just being used. I think we're probably going to see John going rogue later this season and making a big betrayal of the rest of the cast as the Web fully overtakes him, or something to that effect. Maybe not as dramatic, who knows. Anyway, enough of that, let's get on to episode 82. It's given from the Institute and is from, of all people, Daisy. It's her taking statements of the rest of the cast in regards to Leitner's murder. It seems the police are actively pursuing John as the culprit. Daisy takes Martin and Tim's statements, Tim in particular seems lost, before she takes Elias's statement, who goes absolutely sicko mode on her. The majority of the statement is Elias reciting Daisy's memories back to her in an attempt to blackmail her into just fucking off and leaving. It works and she leaves. I'm going to take a shot in the dark here and say that Elias probably has some sort of omniscience as a result of his connection to the Eye. That would certainly make thematic sense, though we do know it has limits considering Leitner was able to hide from Elias for years before eventually being killed by him. Either way, this almost certainly means Elias knows where John is right now and is actively choosing to hide him from the police, which then makes me wonder why Elias even chose to frame John as the murderer in the first place. Like, surely there was another random employee he could have pinned this on. I don't know. I don't know. Elias at this point is kind of an enigma, so hopefully we'll get some answers to that later this season. Episode 83 is relatively unimportant besides the fact that it features a mannequin dressed as a ringleader who then kills someone. John then ties that mannequin to Breekon and Hope and the stranger as a whole because of its uncanny valley nature, and I do definitely agree with him on that connection. Also, the statement John reads in this episode was mailed directly to him, which pretty much confirms my hypothesis that Elias knows where he is. I mean, I can't think of any other character who might know where John is and also has a motive to mail him statements. That being said, I also don't understand why John would make this into a statement. Really, he could have just read it and moved on with the investigation instead of making a statement. This is also everything's confusing. The statement of episode 84 is entirely irrelevant besides the fact that it's recorded by Martin and not John. The post-statement section is important though. Martin finds a bloody Melanie wandering the halls of the archives looking for John. She tells Martin that she was shot by a ghost in India, and not really knowing what to make of that, Martin tries to explain to her why John's missing, which, fair play Martin, I wouldn't know what to make of that either. All of a sudden Elias busts in and offers Melanie a job pretty much on the spot, which, despite Martin's protests, she takes. The episode ends with Martin shouting at himself. Frustrated, he allowed Melanie to be dragged into this. Episode 85 and 86 aren't particularly relevant, though they are both superb pieces of horror on their own. The supplemental of 86 is slightly relevant though. John and Melanie meet, and although Melanie doesn't think John killed Leitner, she's also unsure as to whether she should turn him into the police. She and John end up striking a deal where she keeps an eye on things at the Institute, and John tells her everything. Episode 87 is another statement with a relatively unimportant body and a very important post-statement. During the statement, a woman named Jude Perry is mentioned by Gertrude, who's recording the body of the statement, and Gertrude confirms that this Jude Perry is an acolyte of the Lightless Flame. John manages to get the address for Jude Perry and decides to go pay her a visit as his leads seem to be drying up. He's also able to deduce that the unknowing is related to the stranger and is probably a ritual of some sort. We're going to skip episode 88 entirely and move on to episode 89. John seems to have found Jude Perry and is interviewing her. Jude mentions a number of interesting things. For starters, that what she serves isn't called the Lightless Flame, but the Desolation. She talks about how she came to be a part of the Desolation, and at the end of the conversation gives John a lead on how to find a Michael Crew should he shake her hand. He shakes her hand and it burns him, whatever, anyway. No post-statement here, but we do have a new lead, Michael Crew. We should also change the name of the Lightless Flame to the Desolation. We're going to skip episode 90 and move right on to episode 91, John's confrontation of Michael Crew. The episode opens with John sitting down as Crew offers him some tea. John declines and asks him a question before Crew fucking brain blasts him and makes his body think it's falling at terminal velocity while he's actually sitting down. Despite the fact that John is predisposed, falling from the sky but not actually, Crew ends up talking anyway. He talks about himself. He mentions a number of things like the Lightners he collected, which we won't get into because there are just so goddamn many, and the bulk of this statement is him recounting how he then became a monster. He was struck by lightning as a child and was assailed by a strange creature that took the form of a Lichtenberg figure, never hurting him but taking every opportunity to scare him. The creature eventually found where he lived and took him to an endless labyrinth of corridors and lightning. At the end was his house in the middle of an endless void, which smelled like ozone. Crew found a bunch of Lightners in the coming years and cycled through some looking for a god that spoke to him. He eventually found altiora and killed the creature that stalked him, something he called a branch of the twisting deceit, quote unquote. Crew finishes up and lets John go from his brain blast before telling him to leave. John's exit is interrupted by a knock which Crew answers before being promptly punched in the face by Daisy. She beats him to unconsciousness and drags John with her, taking him to a spot in the woods where she shoots Crew in the head and begins to strangle John to death. John attempts to ask her why she's doing this and she refuses to answer. Just before she kills John, Bouchard appears and convinces Daisy to stop, and the three end up making a plan get John to compel Elias to tell the truth about what's happening. Lots of stuff to talk about here. For starters, I've been burying the hatchet a bit. For the last few episodes John's appeared in, he's been using this ability he seems to have gained that allows him to force people of weaker wills to answer his questions. The plan the three are putting together is to turn this ability on Elias and get some answers about why Elias killed Gertrude. Secondly, Michael Crew is fucking dead. He died, like, pretty anticlimactically, to be honest. Oh well. We're going to take them off the board, and I'm also going to remove the Lightners from the object board because at least right now it seems like the Lightners are less relevant to the plot and are more being used as MacGuffins for world building. Episode 92 begins with Elias in his fuck-ass office, calling the cops to let them know that Daisy Tonner, who the police seem to be searching for, will be there in 15 minutes to try and harm him. The police dispatch a unit. This is one of the shortest statements we get in the series. The entire bulk is a letter delivered to Jonah Magnus from a friend who seems to have become stuck in a mirror world and is deeply lonely. The man begs Jonah to free him, and Elias reads it uncaringly before remarking to John, who he assumes will listen to this tape later, that Jonah never freed the man and just watched because he was curious what would happen to him. Elias remarks that that is the point of the archives, that Gertrude understood that, and that John would do well not to forget it. Elias then says he's ready as Martin enters, bewildered, as John is at the front desk with Daisy and Bouchard. Elias tells Martin to let them in and to go get Tim and Melanie so that they can watch what's about to happen. Daisy, Bouchard, and John enter, and John compels Elias to tell him what happened with Gertrude and Leitner. Elias seems to enjoy being compelled. I'm not going to examine why, and says that he will answer what happened to Gertrude and Leitner, just of his own free will, and only once Tim and Melanie are there. Once everyone is there, Elias confesses to having killed Gertrude and Leitner, tells everyone that Sasha was replaced a year ago, and he calls Micheal an irritant. That's long hands, Micheal. Daisy, having heard enough, draws her gun and is about to kill Elias before the phone rings, and Rosie tells Elias that some police officers are there. Elias, very smugly might I add, tells Daisy that if she kills him right now, the evidence that he was blackmailing her with will be released. Alternatively, she can let him go and this can be forgotten about. Daisy isn't convinced, but Elias further presses her, telling her that if she killed him, she would also kill everyone in the archives, including Bouchard. Elias then continues playing Puppet Master by offering Basira a contract for a job at the archives. If she accepts, then this whole incident would be forgotten about. After a lot of shouting and confusion, Daisy backs down and Basira joins the archives. Everyone but John leaves, and Elias congratulates John on his work done the last few weeks. Apparently, Elias was watching the whole time. He confirms that he was the one sending the tapes to John, and that he won't just tell John the answers as it wouldn't please their master, quote unquote. He tells John that the goal of sending him the tapes was to give John the necessary information to stop the unknowing. Elias won't give us any details that we don't already know, but he does say that the unknowing is the exact antithesis of the I, and that unless John strengthens his abilities, he won't be able to stop it. Finally, John asks Elias if he's human, and Elias doesn't care. He brushes off the question, and the tape finally ends with Elias welcoming John back to work. There was a lot said there, but truthfully, we learned very little. It was mostly just confirmations of theories that we already laid out. The biggest thing we learned is that the cast can't kill Elias without all dying in the process, which I would imagine puts a bit of a damper on most of the plans they were cooking up for escaping the archives. Past that, it seems like things are getting significantly worse for everyone but Elias. We'll skip episodes 93, 94, and 95 because there isn't much of relevance besides some stuff related to Georgie. She gives John a statement in 94 where she recounts an experience she had in college where she met a walking cadaver that whispered something to her so terrible she lost the ability to feel fear. That fact will be relevant later, so just, mark that down in your mind palace. Georgie cannot feel fear, and also she met a walking corpse in college. How relatable. Anyway, episode 96 is from the perspective of Breekon. This is the original Breekon who actually existed before the eponymous Breekon and Hope stole his identity, which is not a joke. Identity theft is not funny. The original Breekon recounts how Breekon and Hope took over the company and eventually left him a strange box which, as John recounts, likely contained something that ate the original Breekon from the inside out. The post-statement is John and Daisy detaining Sarah Baldwin, a victim of the Anglerfish from episode 1. John asks her about the unknowing, and she tells him that it needs ancient gorilla skin that was once kept at a taxidermy store before Gertrude killed the owner and stole it. John is confused as he has no idea what the skin is, leaving Baldwin to make a break for it. Daisy shoots her, but she doesn't bleed, just releasing sawdust and cloves. We're going to quickly go over the post-statements of episodes 97 and 98. The actual bulk of the episodes are largely irrelevant, but what happens afterwards is relevant. As John is musing on the statement of 97, the light in the room blows and John is confronted by Nikola Orsinov, the daughter of Gerard Orsinov and leader of the Circus of the Stranger. She threatens John and tells him that he has to find the skin soon, the gorilla skin that is, or she'll kill him. And she leaves. That's 97. 98 is from the perspective of Elias as Melanie brings him a cup of tea, which Elias then reveals he knows is poisoned. He tries to convince her that he's trying to help, which she doesn't believe, and he formally warns Melanie for trying to kill him, which honestly I would say is fair. Melanie trying to kill Elias will become a running bit in the following episodes, and to be honest, I'm not hugely impressed with Melanie here. She's been in the archives for like 10 episodes and has already broken mentally and is now threatening to kill Elias, and thus everyone else in the cast. Anyway, episode 99 is another irrelevant one in all aspects other than the post-statement section. John has a short conversation with Georgie before going on a walk. As he's walking, he's assaulted by Breekon and Hope, who kidnap him, telling him that Orsinov changed her mind and now wants John dead. I know, she changed her mind very quickly. Bit odd, but we'll move on. Episode 100 is, funnily enough, the least relevant statement in the series. The entire point of the episode is everyone but John taking bullshit statements in an effort to illustrate the fact that John's disappearance is making the archives a lot worse at taking real statements. To be honest, I really dislike this episode. For such a landmark episode, it's so uninteresting and the premise isn't portrayed that well. The post-statement isn't relevant either. It's Melanie leaving to get one of the people giving a statement some water when Peter Lucas appears and he asks the guy waiting for water where Elias's office is. When the guy doesn't know, Lucas seemingly banishes him to the same mirror world the guy from episode 92 was in, which is pretty funny. Episode 101 is a big one though. It begins with Orsinov taunting Elias through a tape recorder. She has John and she explains to him that she's going to peel John's skin off to use in the ritual instead of that gorilla skin they were originally going to use. Before they can do that though, Orsinov has to get some lotion for John's skin as it seems he doesn't take very good care of it. She leaves and the tape recorder clicks off. Some unknown time later, The tape clicks back on as Michael appears. He tells John that he's here to kill him in order to disrupt the ritual of the stranger, but before he does that, he's happy to answer some questions just for the fun of it. John first asks him how he found him, and Michael explains that while the eye watches and the stranger conceals, his master deceives and therefore nothing can be hidden from it. John asks what Michael has to do with the unknowing, and Michael laughs. He has nothing to do with the unknowing other than the fact that he'd really just like it to fail. Killing John would ruin the unknowing and disrupt the archives, which Michael would also like, so that's what he's gonna do. John asks Michael what he is, and Michael laughs as, from his perspective, there's no way to describe what he is. But he does endeavor to tell John who Michael was, the original Michael, who we met last season in a post-statement from Gertrude, although we didn't actually cover that in this video. Michael explains how Gertrude took the original Michael to a place called Sannikov Land, which did not exist and could not exist. A worker of clay had worked for decades to create an impossible monument of doors and laughter to bring the thing that Gertrude was fighting into the world, and as Gertrude in the original Michael landed, she handed him a map of the impossible structure and told him to enter and disrupt the ritual. He did so and became one with the impossible structure. As this happened, Sannikov Land, which never had existed, disappeared, and the followers of the thing were exiled for their failure. None of that mattered to Gertrude, who had already left. The statement ends, and John asks why he never took revenge on Gertrude. Michael explains that she had protections in place to prevent it, and that she wasn't as good of an archivist as John is, and therefore he didn't view her as much of a threat. Michael was hopeful John would stop the unknowing, but it seems like he's going to bring it about instead. John begs for his life, and Michael refuses, telling John that if he screams, the circus will come and skin him, killing him in a much more painful way. With no way out, John accepts his death, and Michael conjures a door for him. John tries to enter, but seems to be locked. Michael remarks that that's impossible before this happens.
Open it, and all this will be over.
It's
What?
It's locked.
It's not.
Why is it locked?
It can't be.
Well, you try it.
That's not... Oh. Oh no.
Do you want to come in?
Oh, Helen?
Let me just say, this moment is amazing. This is one of the best moments in the show. The rising tension of Michael's threats, the looming of John's death, the confusion when the door won't open, and finally, Michael's agonized scream. Truly, there is so much that can be said about this moment. I love how otherworldly the scream sounds and how it fades into the sound of a door opening. It's just a complete masterclass in both build-up and sound design. I'd really recommend that even if you don't watch the show, you go listen to this episode just so that you can get the context to what just happened. Yeah, it's really amazing. It's really amazing. The production team and the writers should be really proud of themselves. Yeah, let's keep going. Michael is gone, and the thing on the other side of the door is, of all people, Helen Richardson. It seems she made her way through the maze in the same way that the original Michael did at one point and has now taken his place. Helen, luckily, is not Michael and thus doesn't want to kill John. Instead, she gives him a door that takes him out of captivity and back to the archives. Lots of important shit here. First off, it turns out Michael, or Helen now I guess, is not only not associated with the stranger, but is actively plotting against them. Let's replace Michael with Helen on the board and just rearrange some stuff now that we know that pretty much everyone not related to the archives on the board is in some way supernatural. And add Melanie. I just realized we never added Melanie to the board. Like I said, folks, it's all complicated. Episode 102 begins with John cussing out Elias for not sending somebody to look for him for the apparent month he was gone. Elias, remaining on brand, does not care. John tries to press Elias further for information on the unknowing, and Elias, remarkably calmly, tells him that he pretty much has no idea what the unknowing is, as Gertrude hid most of her research from him. He's of very little use as John just bounces ideas off of him, eventually offhand saying that Gertrude was working with Gerard Keay. This makes Elias very happy as nobody actually told this to John, he just kind of knew it. That is, in Elias's words, a good sign that a knife-wielding Melanie is coming up the stairs to kill Elias again, and he asks John to stop her. John does so, and Melanie leaves before John continues recording a statement, which we won't talk about here, other than to mention that it was written entirely in French, a language that John, very much so, cannot read. During the post-statement, John realizes that Gertrude and Gerard went to New Zealand during their travels, and he departs to go after them. Episode 103 isn't particularly relevant other than the mention of a circus, though it isn't explicitly called the Orsinov Circus, so we'll just move on to episode 104, the statement of Timothy Stoker regarding his brother's disappearance. I've been burying the hatchet again these last few episodes. Tim has been acting increasingly erratic since the confrontation in episode 92, and this seems to be the culmination of that. Tim recounts how his brother decided to go urban exploring in the ruins of the original Covent Garden Theatre designed by Robert Smirke. Tim objected, but his brother, Danny, insisted. He came back hours later, deeply shaken. Tim tried to get Danny to lie down and get some rest as he came back during the night, but once Tim awoke in the morning, he found that Danny was gone and that several drawings of a grotesque clown, somewhat resembling Joseph Grimaldi, had been left. Tim followed after his brother before finding a hidden room that seemed to have been whittled entirely out of marble, with carved shapes resembling humans in the seats. The lights of the theatre blinked on, and Tim saw Danny on stage, completely still. The clown from Danny's drawing appeared, tall and thin, and walked up to Danny before, as if it was pulling a tablecloth from a table, it pulled Danny's skin from the figure standing on stage. Underneath was a beautiful play of colours that somewhat resembled an impressionist painting of a dancer. The next thing Tim knew, he was on the street holding a flyer for the Circus of the Other. That clown was on front, billed as a guest performer. The flyer then crumbled to ashes. During the post-statement, Martin asks Tim if he ever returned, but Tim says that he isn't sure that that place would allow him to leave for a second time. During this, Elias enters and asks Martin to leave, who obliges. Tim deeply wants to find and destroy the circus as recompense for what it did to his brother, but Elias clearly views Tim as a liability and forbids him from even trying. The episode ends with Tim telling Elias he'll have to kill him if he wants to stop him. Big character moment here for Tim. He's been largely absent from this season, so it's nice to see him back and active, though it does seem like he's swiftly deteriorating too. I think it's safe to say that the clown that killed Danny was almost certainly not Grigor or Nikola Orsinov. As the flyer said, it was a guest performer, which means that, while being relevant to Tim's character, probably isn't entirely relevant to the circus, or the unknowing. Episode 105 and 106 don't contain much relevant information, though they are both great pieces of horror. Let me also just stop for a moment to say that this video is doing the Magnus Archives a deep disservice. No matter how hard I try to make this video interesting and a good reflection of the mysteries of the archives, it still doesn't contain the actual important part of the series, the statements. The Magnus Archives should really be viewed as a collection of horror stories with an overarching narrative, and I am essentially removing the actual horror stories from the equation by making this video. That is, of course, a purposeful incentive to try and get you folks to listen to the series, but that's neither here nor there. The series is good, and I'm doing it a disservice by making this video. That being said, all the criticism to come is delivered from the perspective of somebody who's listened to the series multiple times. Anyway, enough of that. Episode 107 doesn't contain any relevant information besides the scene in the post statement. After John finishes his statement, he boards a bus to Washington, D.C. He's in the US now. But during a break from the driving, he's kidnapped, again, though less forcefully this time, by Julia Montauk, the woman from episode 9. Soon after, they're stopped and pulled over by a police officer who identifies himself as Max Musterman. He asks Julia and John to step out of the car and open the trunk. They do so, and Musterman is immediately shot by Trevor Herbert, who was hiding in the trunk with a gun. That doesn't immediately kill Musterman, so Herbert tells John to grab an axe from the boot. Episode 108 doesn't contain much of relevance, and 109 connects directly to what we were talking about, so we'll just skip to 109. John, Julia, and Trevor are in a secluded cabin alongside Musterman, who seems to have been following John since he arrived in America. At the beginning of the statement, they're waiting for Musterman to regrow his face so that he can be questioned by John in regards to why he was following him. Julia and Trevor seem to have heard of the unknowing, and unless John can convince them that he plans to stop it, they'll likely kill him. In the meantime, John proposes that one of them give their statement on what happened to them since they last gave one. Last we heard, Trevor had almost died of cancer, and Julia was completely unable to hold down a job, and now they're both out here killing monsters. Julia was working a night job as a security guard in the summer of 2010. She had been struggling to hold down a regular job for years because of her father's infamy, which led her to take a night job at a workspace in Manchester. The company that owned the building rented it out to people during the day and did work at night. She only spoke to one person from that company while working there, a manager named Darvish, who Trevor had been hunting for weeks as he suspected Darvish of being a vampire. One night, Trevor managed to slip into the building and went in search of Darvish with Julia hot on his tail as she spotted him. She soon reached the 4th floor with Trevor nowhere in sight before the lights blew. The floor seemed to be flooded by cold, still black water that seemed impossibly deep. Julia eventually found Darvish stood around a table with 2 other employees of his company. Lying on the table was a man, that same black water trickling from his eyes and mouth to the floor. As Julia tried to step into the room, she fell into the water and, just as she was about to go fully under, was pulled back up by Trevor. Darvish then leapt forwards, attacking Trevor savagely and almost killing him. As Trevor battled Darvish, Julia noticed a tattoo on Darvish's hand, the same one she saw when she was a child. She picked up the pocket knife Trevor had been using to try and stab Darvish and plunged it into him, killing him. As Darvish fell to the ground dead, the water dried up immediately and the 2 other workers collapsed, the man on the table having already been dead for a while. The 2, those being Julia and Trevor, paired up, killing the remaining workers and leaving immediately. They've been hunting monsters ever since. They came to America years ago in search of a, quote, wolf man, but since they didn't have any money, they travelled illegally and thus have no way of getting back. Musterman interjects at this point and explains that he was following John in hopes of getting his skin for the unknowing. The episode ends with John seeming to have been exonerated. Gotta say, I really appreciate the reintroduction of Julia and Trevor to the story. It feels like a very cool way to add new characters to the story to replace the ones that have died recently. So let's just add them to the board. Episode 110 doesn't contain much of relevance besides being another episode about spiders, so we're going to skip to episode 111. Before we do that though, I want to say that I don't appreciate the little formula we've got going on here, where every odd episode is really important and every even episode is almost entirely irrelevant. Like, think about it, I've skipped pretty much every even episode for the last, 40, and I've only ever talked about the odd ones. Once you've noticed that pattern, you kinda can't help but switch your brain off during even episodes this season, and that's a damn shame because this season has some of the best statements we see in the entire show. As frustrating, but whatever. Anyway, episode 111 begins with Julia and Trevor leaving John alone in the cabin after they dealt with Musterman. They give him a book, a Leitner, and tell him to read the last page. He does so, and after finishing the book, who else appears but Gerard Keay? It would seem this book is the same that Mary Keay mentioned in episode 62, and now her son is stuck in it. Anyway, Gerard is completely unwilling to help John stop the unknowing because he isn't actually alive. His soul, or something like his soul, is trapped in the book, and being forced to exist while not being alive is, in Gerard's words, existentially painful. Eventually the 2 strike a deal. Gerard will tell John everything he knows in regard to the unknowing, and John will destroy Gerard's page, setting him free. The 2 agree, and Gerard begins. The conclusion he and Gertrude eventually came to was that, while the unknowing could be delayed, it could not be fully prevented as everything within the ritual was replaceable, i.e. the people, the location, the items, they could all be switched out. That being said, once the ritual started, the 2 believed there might be a way to stop it. Gertrude never actually told Gerard what the ritual might be vulnerable to, but Gerard did know of a storage unit that Gertrude believed could prevent it in some way. He gives John the location of the storage unit and the 2 continue. Gerard mentions Mary Keay and how strange she was. In her own words, she wanted to start a mystic dynasty similar to the Lucas family. Gerard also mentions that the Fairchilds, while appearing dynastic, aren't actually a family. They're more of a collective who take on a specific surname. John finishes up the preamble by asking Gerard if he would be willing to give a statement, because this has all been pre-statement talk apparently, and Gerard agrees. He talks about his mother. She believed she had been cheated out of the legacy she wanted so badly, and aspired to use the gods, the entities, without pinning herself to one in particular. She admired Leitner greatly, as he did a sort of similar thing. Gerard was born in the 80s, and his father died shortly after. He was killed by Mary in his sleep. And Mary sort of indoctrinated Gerard into her way of life, giving him an occult education and taking him with her on trips around the world to meet creatures of the night and collect objects of power. Gerard wasn't a huge fan of the lifestyle, but frankly, he had no other skills, and living a normal life was terribly boring to him, so he stuck by his mother until her death. He came to the bookstore one day, that was mentioned in episode 4, to find his mother, partially skinned. She had attempted a ritual to take control of the Catalogue of the Dead, which is the book that Gerard's trapped in now, and had partially skinned herself. Bleeding out quickly, she begged Gerard to finish the ritual, but he panicked and ran. He was arrested shortly after for his mother's murder. Thankfully, the ritual had partially worked, and Mary manifested in reality, tampering with the evidence and forcing several witnesses to withdraw their testimonies, ultimately meaning that Gerard could not be tried. For the next 5 years, Gerard was haunted by Mary, who often had trouble existing. When she didn't exist, he occupied his time destroying Lightners and trying to evade his mother's power, as when she did exist, she was powerful and erratic, difficult to be around. Eventually, he met Gertrude, who offered to destroy his mother's page, freeing him and killing Mary for good. That's the end of Gerard's statement, but there is still more. This is actually the biggest revelation of the show, potentially. In the post-statement, Gerard gives us a definitive list of the gods, which he calls the entities. We'll refer to them as such from now on. 14 entities, as defined by Robert Smirk, are as such. The eye, fear of being watched, of being exposed, of having secrets uncovered. The spiral, fear of madness, of lies, of something being fundamentally incorrect. The end, fear of death. The stranger, fear of the uncanny, of something not being right, of being followed. The lonely, fear of isolation, lack of connection. The desolation, fear of pain, loss, unnecessary destruction. The slaughter, fear of violence, aggression, unpredictable pain. The vast, fear of falling, massive spaces, massive things, our own insignificance. The buried, fear of small spaces, of being crushed, not being able to breathe. The dark, fear of the dark and what might be in it. The corruption, fear of insects, rot, infection, decay, itching, and burrowing. The web, fear of spiders, of being controlled or manipulated. The flesh, fear of being eaten, of the process of being slaughtered. The hunt, fear of being hunted, of having to run for your life. Now, of course, those aren't the only things we fear, but those fears overlap and intermingle within the complex human psyche to create new fears we couldn't possibly define. What's worse, in Gerard's experience, there have only ever been the 14 entities. There are no gods of love, of humanity, nothing. It's just fear. And of course, they're avatars. That's what John is, what both Michaels were, and what Gertrude was. These are humans given power from their gods to cause pain and fear. These gods feed on suffering, specifically on fear, and these avatars are the things that feed them. This is a lot, but we're still going. The unknowing is, of course, not the only ritual. Every entity has one, and they take hundreds of years to build up to the point where they can be performed, and once stopped, it's back to square one. These rituals, if completed, merge the chosen entity with the world as a whole, turning the world into a living hell. These rituals might bring some other fears through with them, but only if they overlap in major ways. The stranger would bring through the spiral, but not the eye. Gertrude stopped a bunch of these, the one that Michael mentioned in episode 101 being the main one. She was working to stop the unknowing, and after that, the Watcher's Crown, the ritual of the eye. With that last tidbit, John closes the book and dismisses Gerard, killing him soon after the episode ends. That was a lot. It was a lot. I think it's time for the boards to merge, and for us to arrive at the board we'll end the series with. A lot has changed on the board, so let's just go over it quickly. We've got the 14 fears up and their main avatars, if they have one that we know of, just below it. Some of these avatars are dead, like Agnes Montague and Maxwell Rayner, but I think it's best to keep them on there just so that the entities have someone to represent them on the board. You may also notice that the art representing the entities looks kind of poster-ish, and that's because these are all posters that you can buy from the actual official Magnus Archives Redbubble store. I own a couple of these and they're great. If you want one, the link will be in the description. Thumbs up, not sponsored, obviously. I just like them. You may also not be able to tell who some of the main avatars representing the entities are, so I'll just go over them quickly, from top to bottom, left to right. John's there for the eye, Helen's there for the spiral, Nikola Orsinov for the stranger, Peter Lucas for the lonely, Agnes Montague for the desolation, Simon Fairchild for the vast, Maxwell Rayner for the dark, John Amherst for the corruption, Raymond Fielding for the web, Jared Hopsworth for the flesh, and Julia and Trevor Montauk for the hunt. Anyway, that's that. Let's move on. Episode 112 is largely irrelevant besides the fact that John returns to London, Basira and Daisy start a fight to distract Elias while John visits Gertrude's hidden storage unit, and Basira confirms she's working with Martin and Melanie to free themselves from Elias's control. Episode 113 is much the same, with the only part of relevance being the pre-statement preamble. John, Martin and Melanie investigate Gertrude's storage unit and find the destroyed remnants of the gorilla skin, a bunch of notebooks with arbitrary dates and times, and a large number of explosives. That is probably the way Gertrude intended to disrupt the ritual. Episode 114 and 115 follow in that vein, though their statements are of little note. Firstly, 114's statement involves Hilltop Road. The woman giving the statement took a cleaning job there before being pulled into a dark crack and ending up in a seemingly alternate London. Episode 114 and 115 follow in that vein, though their statements are of at least a little bit of note. Firstly, 114's statement involves Hilltop Road. The woman giving the statement took a cleaning job there before being pulled into a dark crack and ending up in a seemingly alternate London, one without notable landmarks, and one where the people she knew didn't know her. 115's statement is from Mikaele Salesa, though it doesn't contain anything of note. It is interesting that Salesa had visited the archives, though. 114's post-statement is from John. He and Tim have a short conversation where it becomes increasingly clear that Tim is kind of losing his mind. He tells John that he's the only person who he can be sure hasn't been replaced by the anglerfish. Regardless of that, Tim has made some good discoveries. Firstly, the circus is currently hiding out in the House of Wax in Greater Yarmouth, and has replaced the skin they were going to use for the ritual with, get this, Gertrude Robinson's skin, and also the skin of a man we've never heard of before called George Icarus, who we'll later learn is Jürgen Leitner. That means the ritual is ready to start any day now. Later, John meets with Basira and Daisy in the tunnels, away from Elias's watch, and confirms that the explosives are real and that Daisy knows how to use them. Our season is reaching its climax. Episode 116 begins with Elias bringing the group together to go over their plan a final time. They're going to sneak into the Wax Museum, wait for the ritual to start, and detonate the explosive when it nears its climax. Elias thinks that the plan has a good chance of working, but suggests that the group listen to a statement from Gertrude that goes over a previous attempt at the unknowing. The ritual was quite similar to the one the cast are about to stop, only it was carried out by animatronics and was performed as an opera instead of a dance, although dancing did occur at some point. Ultimately, the ritual was stopped when an avatar of the slaughter, a commander at the head of a battalion of eyeless soldiers, busted the door down and killed all of the automatons. Gertrude finishes by saying that destroying the ritual from the inside should be enough to stop it. Ultimately, the group agree that Daisy, Basira, John, and Tim will go, leaving Elias, Martin, and Melanie behind at the archives, though obviously John doesn't tell Elias that he's going to allow Tim to come. Episode 117 is great. There are a lot of big character moments for our cast, and getting to hear their thoughts on what's about to happen is cool on its own. Still, it doesn't contain any plot-relevant information, other than Melanie recounting how she was shot by a ghost bullet in India last season, and Tim outright stating that he has no expectation of living through this operation, but that he doesn't really care. Besides that, there's really nothing else to say. Let's go and end the season. Episode 118 begins with Martin burning a number of statements to create a distraction. Elias shows up to stop him, and Martin gleefully taunts him before Elias realizes he's being distracted and forces unwanted information into Martin's mind, more specifically the fact that Martin's mother hates him because he looks like his father and that nothing he could ever do would change that. Martin is obviously reduced to tears, and Elias leaves to search for Melanie. She finds Martin before Elias finds her, and she tells him that she got what she needed from Elias's office while Martin was distracting him. She also suggests they try and kill Elias one more time, but Martin tells her not to. In the House of Wax, Daisy, Basira, John, and Tim have been planting explosives. The tape clicks on just as they finish planting the last one, and music begins to play. Risking it all, they poke their heads into the auditorium to catch a glimpse of what's happening, and music begins to play. Daisy finishes setting up the explosive and hands John the detonator. Before they can make their next move, Nikola Orsinov announces that the show has begun and the world begins to go wrong. Episode 119 begins as the strangers begin to dance. Let me be honest, things make no sense here and nobody knows anything. John encounters two victims of the anglerfish, and speaking in Tim's voice, they convince John to give them the detonator. He gives it to them without resistance, and they leave with it. As this is happening, Daisy is being pursued by Breekon and Hope, They tell her that they're Basira and she threatens to kill them. They taunt her as she laughs while beating Hope to death brutally. Tim sees Basira but doesn't know who she is. She tries to talk to him but he doesn't know her and he tries to hit her before running away. Basira is confused. John remarks that what's happening isn't real and Orsinov appears, telling him that just because he doesn't understand it doesn't make it a lie. She switches between people, telling John that she's Tim, then Sasha, then Gertrude, then Leitner. John tries to fight back, but he doesn't know what hands are and he doesn't know how to make a fist with which to fight. Nikola taunts him in Gertrude's voice, telling him that she defeated many rituals during her life, prevented many apocalypses, and she calls him pathetic for failing to defeat even one. She then speaks in Leitner's voice, telling him that it was his fault for failing to stop his death that day because he went to go smoke a cigarette. Nikola wonders whether John even knows what a cigarette is anymore. John asks what they want, and Nikola, now speaking as herself, tells John that she wants him to dance. John screams as he gets dragged away. We cut to Daisy fighting Breekon. She's struggling to get the upper hand, and while laughing hysterically, Breekon catches her by the throat and tosses her into the open coffin, calling her a stupid animal and locking her within it. Basira's attempting to escape the madness while this is happening. She doesn't know who she is, or what she is, or where she is, or when. She concludes by picking a where and moving to it, presumably away from the explosives. Nikola taunts John, telling him that it's almost complete, the new world, and once it's there, it will be all his fault. John sees the clown truly for the first time, bitter and cruel, seeking out the circus to find his fortune before being torn apart by its ringmaster. He's sometimes a clown, sometimes a doll, sometimes a mannequin, but always pretending to be something he's not, hiding beneath foreign skin and behind another's name. As this is happening, Tim leaps in, attacking the victim of the anglerfish and wresting the detonator from it. He still doesn't know what's happening and begins to attack John. As he's attacked, John uses his powers to show Tim the truth of what's happening. He is Tim and he is holding a detonator. He knows what the detonator does and he can stop this. John is whisked away as Tim sees the clown in front of him that took his brother and wore his face. As Nikola begs Tim not to detonate it, he speaks into the tape recorder. He tells John that he does not forgive him, but he is thankful for getting to do this. Tim tells a final joke to Nikola and she tells him that it's not funny. Tim knows that and detonates the explosives. We cut forward as episode 120 begins. The statement is given by Elias Bouchard as he pulls the dreams from a comatose John. The only people that can be confirmed to have survived the blast were John and Basira. Tim is certainly dead, and while Daisy may be alive, she's missing. Elias describes John's dreams back to him. He watches in horror as Dr. Lionel Elliot begs for his release. John can't help him and just watches the man writhe in pain. He watches Breekon and Hope allow Daisy's partner to enter the coffin, though she's nowhere to be seen. John enters the coffin too, and though he's trapped beneath endless, crushing dirt, the Eye still watches him. He sees Melanie, her excursion into India, and her being shot. He watches Carolina Gorka be crushed by mountains of dirt in her train car, an advert on the side simply reading "Dig." John watches as Jane Prentiss is turned to ash and the man burning her watches him, not sure if he's more afraid of Jane or of John. John watches Julia and Trevor stalk members of the People's Church of the Divine Host, with a look on their faces that reminds him of Daisy. He begs to go back to the fiery dreams of Jude Perry, but she blocked him out once she realized he was watching. John watches Georgie in a dissection room. She gives him a look of pity, one he wishes he could look away from. He looks up and sees the beholding, and the dream starts all over again. In the post-statement, Martin enters with a police inspector who places Elias under arrest for the murder of Leitner. Elias hands over a USB with blackmail on it for leniency and is let out of the archives in handcuffs. The season ends with Peter Lucas appearing behind Martin. In Elias's absence, he will be heading the archives, and he tells Martin that together, they will do great things. That is the end of Season 3 of the Magnus Archives. In my opinion, it was definitely the weakest season yet. I think that's largely because it felt like a transitional season. The mysteries of the archives have largely been uncovered, and we're moving on to a model where the seasons are more focused on the characters and on stopping the entities rather than uncovering what they are. I think there were also a lot of issues with the characters this season. I'll start by saying that Martin was great. Him failing to stop Melanie and Bouchard from joining is great, and it sets him up for some potentially great moments later on in the show. Still, I really didn't like Tim and Melanie this season. I thought that they were really aggressive toward John for seemingly no reason. From the perspective of a writer, I think what happened was probably that the writers got an idea in their head as to why Tim and Melanie began to really hate John, and then either forgot or failed to write that idea clearly into the story, because, like, from where I'm standing, it just seems like the relationship between the two and John just deteriorated to the point where Tim's last words were essentially him cussing out John, even though John had just done him a huge favor by letting him come to the mission to stop the unknown. Melanie's behavior is also just kind of bizarre. It seems fairly likely that killing Elias will kill the rest of the cast, and yet she just keeps on trying. It makes it really hard to like Melanie when she's just hell-bent on killing the entire cast for no good reason. Maybe my media literacy is fucked and I'm missing something here, but it definitely felt like these things weren't adequately explained. Besides that, there isn't much to be said in regards to the board, other than the fact that we can remove Tim and the unknowing from the board. Let's move on to Season 4 and see if the Magnus Archives can stick the landing and transition away from the mystery format. Season 4 begins with a man speaking to John, Oliver Banks, the true identity of the man from episode 11, the man who foresaw Gertrude's death. John has been in a coma for 6 months by the time Oliver gets to him, and Oliver recounts how the vines overwhelmed him and he began to isolate himself to escape them, an endeavor which failed entirely. Around this time he heard of Point Nemo, the point farthest away from any human civilization and thus the most free from the vines. He endeavored to make a trip out there, but without money, he wouldn't be able to. Instead, he found an expedition that was set to go to Point Nemo, stole the identity of one of its members, which is not funny, identity theft is not a joke, and sailed off with them none the wiser. As he sailed, he enjoyed quiet nights and general peace until, finally, they reached Point Nemo and the vines returned greater than ever, feeding out of every member in the boat. It was at that moment Oliver understood what he had to do. He killed the captain, hijacked the boat, and drove it to where the vines originated from. There he sat and waited until a satellite fell from the sky, killing him and everyone on board. Oliver is an avatar of the end. He's undead. He tells John that while he's not human enough to die, he's also not enough of a monster to live. He has to choose one of the two. Will he live or will he die? Oliver leaves as Georgie enters the hospital and cusses him out, immediately recognizing that he's not human. As the tape ends, we hear Georgie chasing after Oliver, seeming to have recognized something within him, and we hear static as John begins to breathe again, clearly having chose to become more monster than man. I really appreciate this episode. I think that John's slow descent into becoming a monster is very cool and very poignant. My hope here is that John will visually change into something more disturbing, but that's yet to be seen. I'm going to add Oliver Banks to the board as the main avatar for the end as well. Episode 122 is about John waking from his coma. Bouchard quickly catches him up on Elias being in jail, Peter Lucas taking over the archives, Martin working for him, and Daisy's disappearance and Tim's death. John returns to work soon after in 123, which begins with Melanie busting down the door to John's office and attacking him for, quote, getting Tim and Daisy killed and for being a monster. John tries to calm her and fails, but she ultimately leaves, telling him to stay away from her regardless. Refer to the end of Season 3 retrospective from a few minutes ago. Melanie is absolutely out of control, and the reasons she's giving for getting mad at John just don't make much sense. He was going up against the entire circus, Tim had already made peace with his death, and if John hadn't become a monster, he would have died. Maybe she's not aware of a few of these things, but even past that, I hardly think that attacking John is the most productive thing to do here, you know? It feels like Melanie is just grasping at straws. You know, it's making me struggle to like her character. John goes to talk to Bouchard, who tells him that ever since the unknowing failed, other entities have been attacking the archives with increasing regularity because the Eye is the only entity that hasn't performed a ritual recently. A couple of months ago, the Flash attacked the archives and Melanie single-handedly fought them off with a knife. I'm quickly popping in to say the fact that Melanie protected the archives with a knife, which, by the way, is nuts. Doesn't really change my opinion on her character being deeply flawed and difficult to like, but that's besides the point. John has yet to meet Peter Lucas, the new head of the archives, and it seems that he's not the only one. Peter Lucas only speaks through Martin, who is becoming increasingly isolated, and besides that, nobody else has really seen him. Lucas's influence is felt, though. When two researchers ignored his instructions, they went missing, presumably presumably being sent to that mirror world. Episode 124 features Simon Fairchild tormenting some people on a cable car and John trying to talk to Martin and failing as he's too busy. And episode 125 is about two constables, which, if you don't know, constables are British police officers, making their way through a Resident Evil 4 style town with a bunch of zombified people in it. After the statement is done, John muses on how, quote-unquote, in control people under the sway of the slaughter seem to be. He mentions that Martin's avoiding him and how he's concerned about Peter Lucas potentially being a threat. After he's done musing on that, he mentions he's worried about Melanie and says something along the lines of that bullet pumping violence into her, waiting to turn this place into another land crack. As he says that, static plays above his words, signaling he's using his powers, and he mentions that he knows that the bullet that was lodged in her by those Indian ghosts is infecting her in some way. We cut to him and Basira talking. Melanie is fast asleep, knocked out on sleeping pills, and John and Basira, this is real, administer local aesthetic and perform surgery to remove the bullet, which seems to be causing something of a spiritual infection. As John removes it, Melanie wakes up and stabs John with a scalpel, screaming that she can't feel her leg. Basira drags John away to give Melanie some time to herself, and the episode ends here. It doesn't take a genius to see what's happening here. Those ghosts that shot her all those episodes ago were creations of the slaughter, and the bullet lodged in Melanie was making her an avatar of the slaughter. Now that it's gone, she should get better. Let me just say, I fucking hate this plot point. I hate this plot point. It's perhaps my least favorite part of the show because there was no reasonable way for the audience to get this before the character did. I mean, John literally needed like a deus ex machina of information put into his mind artificially to understand what was happening to Melanie, and only then could he reveal to us what was going on. It's so cheap. You don't get to do a single episode setup and reveal in a show like the Magnus Archives. Or if you do that, it can't be interesting. One of the things that made the first seasons so engaging was the mystery, was trying to figure out what the entities were, who the imposter was in season 2, who killed Gertrude. Now that those mysteries have been revealed, it feels like the show is floundering and failing to create new interesting plot points to keep us engaged. I'm being really hard on the show right now, not only because this shit is stupid, but also because I like this show and I want it to be better. Like, this is not interesting, and I hope they remedy that. Episode 126 is about the man that created that impossible structure in Sannikov land back in episode 101, and it's a very cool episode, but the bit that's really relevant is the post-statement. Melanie's still unwilling to speak to John. That doesn't really shock me, to be honest. Even if she's free of the influence of the slaughter, John still performed impromptu surgery on her, and that's pretty fucked up. That post-statement section cuts out, and we cut back in to hear Martin essentially cooing at a tape recorder like it's a pet, saying that it's back because John is back and that he missed both of them. Peter Lucas appears and scolds Martin, telling him that he's, quote, the only one who can pull this off, and that Martin is the only one who could possibly balance the two, and that if they don't pull this off, it'll be over for everyone, including John. Peter Lucas insults Bouchard for his lack of foresight, believing he could possibly pull off the Watcher's crown alone. He gives Martin a couple of statements from Adelard Decker, and Martin remarks that once this is all over, he'll tell John the truth, before Peter Lucas replies that once it's all over, he won't want to, but everyone will be safe. So, there's something interesting happening here. It seems like Season 4 is going to be focused around the Watcher's crown, which, alas, the board, but I have to ask, if that really is the case, why is Peter Lucas involved? It does seem like the Eye and the Lonely go hand in hand, but surely he would be shooting to create or complete his own ritual, while the other powers are distracted with the Watcher's crown. Now, this is, again, a theory, but judging by what Peter Lucas is saying in this episode, I think he might be attempting to create sort of a double ritual, one that's joint between the Lonely and the Eye. Peter Lucas is now isolating Martin to put him in contact with the Lonely, and Martin has already worked at the archives for years, so he would be the ideal person to act as a conduit for the ritual. Let's keep that in mind to see if we're right. Episode 127 is, conveniently for that theory, about a doctor who visits a man in the isolated countryside and, while in his house, feels like he's constantly being watched while also being completely alone. Kind of obvious theming, definitely feels like it strengthens my theory, but the post-statement part is what's really important. The start is Melanie is getting better. She asks Basira to tell John that she's sorry for stabbing him, and of course John accepts the apology. Melanie's wound has already healed significantly faster than it should have, and Basira expresses how uncomfortable she is with John's new powers, and John says that, quote, there's an ocean of knowledge behind a door in his mind, and that if he opens the door, he'll drown. That suggests that he's not entirely a monster yet, and he's kind of having this, I don't know if transhumanist is the right word, but I'm going to say it anyway. He's having this sort of transhumanist struggle between he fully gives in, loses his humanity, and takes on the aspect of a monster to gain new powers that could potentially save his friends, or if he's going to just, retain his humanity and see how that goes. It's a very interesting plot point, and I think it's good. Basira also mentions, by the way, that during John's time being comatose, Martin's mother died, which is not great. The post-statement continues with Basira going to visit Elias in prison. He tells her that while removing the bullet did a lot of good for Melanie as a person, it rendered the archives defenseless at a time where it needs a protector. He tells Basira he knows how to protect the Institute, and she agrees to hear him out. Episode 128 is from Breekon, Episode 128 is from Breekon, the fake Breekon that is, as he delivers a package to the archives, the coffin. He tells John and Basira that Daisy is still alive inside, forever entombed. John extracts a statement from Breekon, and while not particularly relevant here, there is an interesting passage where Breekon talks about the web. He says that it, quote, knows too much to be a stranger, but hides its knowing well enough to endure. I'd suggest you folks keep the theory that we talked about earlier in mind, the one about John being marked by the web. Now granted, that idea never came to fruition in Season 3, but, it could be a part of Season 4. Even if we ignore that, I feel like there is still a pretty good chance that John is being manipulated, even now. Episode 129 begins with a conversation between Martin and John. John tries to get Martin to talk to him, but ultimately fails. It seems that Martin is sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. He needs to avoid John to keep him safe, but he really wants to talk to him. John mentions towards the end of the conversation that he doesn't really have anyone to talk to and that he misses Martin. By the way, I haven't really been mentioning this because this video is going to be insanely long as is. The script is like 70 pages, but there have been romantic undertones brewing between Martin and John since the beginning of Season 2, and perhaps we'll see that come to fruition later in the series. Either way, John finishes the statement, and once he's finished, he talks to the recorder about how uncomfortable he is with the beholding putting knowledge that he doesn't want into his head. Like, for example, how Gertrude one time stopped the burieds ritual by chopping up a person marked by the vast and just throwing them into the ritual site. He struggles to distinguish knowledge the beholding has given him and knowledge he's acquired on his own, and that scares him. He does wonder whether the knowledge of how Gertrude stopped the burieds ritual has to do with him saving Daisy from the coffin. He wonders whether he could attempt a rescue if he had an anchor, quote unquote, something that reminded him of the world outside and could lead him back. Episode 130 is interesting. It describes how Gertrude destroyed the ritual of the flesh, the same way she planned to destroy the unknowing, from the perspective of somebody visiting the ritual site around the same time. The important part comes at the very end, though, after Gertrude's final comments. John remarks that he's sure that the web gave him the statement to convince him to create a flesh anchor, in his words, for his voyage into the coffin. He's planning to amputate a limb so that that limb can act as an anchor. That theory I said about the web is kind of being strengthened here. Even John is able to recognize here that the web is probably manipulating him. So, keep it in mind. Episode 131 is the statement of Gerard Hopsworth, the bone turner. It starts with John having a conversation with Melanie. She is still deeply angry with him and Basira for the impromptu surgery they performed on her without her consent. She tells him how she still has nightmares about her experiences, and that her sense of privacy has already been shattered by working at the Institute. Side note, while this is happening, John is trying to cut off a finger to use as a flash anchor. John tries to downplay what he did, and Melanie isn't having any of it. The bullet affirmed her anger and allowed her to create an identity around it. Despite that, the bullet didn't create her anger, and it was allowed to remain in her body because she wanted it to stay. Essentially, the bullet worsened her feelings of anger, but it didn't create them. I do think that's a very interesting approach to resolving Melanie's character struggles, and while I do definitely think that the build-up to the reveal of the bullet and the actual removal of it sucked, I do approve of where Melanie's character is going from here. It seems much more grounded and reasonable instead of just being pure violence for the sake of it. Anyway, Melanie changes the subject abruptly and asks John why he's trying to cut off his finger. He explains the flash anchor to Melanie and jokes that he needs Gerard Hopsworth. Melanie tells him to come with her. He follows Melanie and ends up finding a number of Helen's doors downstairs. After the attack on the Institute, Helen helped with the cleanup by putting the remainder of the flesh entities into her corridors, including Gerard Hopsworth. While John is very skeptical of Helen's intentions, he agrees to get her help and she lets Gerard out of her corridors. He's deeply angry and wants to kill John, but he knows that if he did kill John, he'd be stuck in the corridors forever, so he agrees to help John take a rib in exchange for his freedom, with an extra rib being taken for a statement. The statement details how Gerard came to attack the Institute, and it's largely irrelevant here. After some preamble, Gerard takes the ribs from John, incorporating one for himself and leaving one for John, who promptly passes out. Helen and Melanie find John outside the corridors with his freshly taken rib. Another side note, when Melanie asks where Helen put Gerard, she tells him it was a good distance above a river. Quite funny. Anyway. With a rib he can use as a flash anchor, John is now ready to venture into the coffin, which he does in the next episode, 132. He leaves a tape recorder with his goodbyes for the others and brings one with him. We hear static as the coffin compels him to enter until John tells him that he's willing to enter without compulsion. John descends the stairs as they become increasingly narrow until he's pressed in on all sides. He calls out for Daisy and eventually finds her. Now that John's found her, he tries to find his anchor, but can't. He panics and him and Daisy begin to talk. Daisy records a statement to that point. In the statement, she tells him that she's been cut off from the hunt, meaning that she's an avatar for the hunt, which, will add her to the board really quickly, and that in the coffin, she feels more like herself and that she's scared to go back to the way she was before. She recalls the statement that Elias took from her in episode 82 and says that the hunt has always been part of her life and that while she doesn't want to be a predator again, she doesn't want to be prey either. She's afraid that, above all, she won't get to choose which she is. John assures her that there are always choices. She admits that after the unknowing, she planned to kill John as she had started seeing him in her dreams. These dreams weren't natural, they predicted things about John like what he'd wear the next day, and because of that, she realized he wasn't human. John tells her that he's even less human now, but at this point, Daisy doesn't really care. They strain as the buried squeezes even deeper in on them. Suddenly, John begins to feel his anchor better and he guides himself and Daisy out of the coffin. Basira bursts into the room where the anchor is to see dozens of tape recorders recording throughout the room. As John emerges, Basira begins to scold him before she sees Daisy behind him. Episode 133 happens directly after. It's the recounting of a statement from a man who witnessed the hunt's ritual but never saw it be completed. Daisy's in the room as John records it, and after the statement's over, John asks why it was never completed, even without outside interference. Daisy tells him that's because the hunt probably never wanted it to end. Her least favourite part of being a cop was arresting the suspect since it meant the hunt was over. Basira enters and gets Daisy to leave, and in a heartbreaking scene, once Daisy is gone, Basira admits to John that while she's happy to have Daisy back, she's essentially dead weight right now because she's not a part of the hunt, and Basira is going to have to leave her behind to survive. Episode 134 is an interesting one. It's recorded by Martin and is a letter from Adelard Decker to Gertrude in regards to a 15th entity. Adelard explains that he believes a 15th entity will come into being soon, one known as the Extinction. It represents a fear of extinction, a fear of change, and a fear of being forgotten in a more grand sense. As Martin finishes reading the statement, Peter Lucas chimes in, having been in the room with him while the statement was being recorded, and Lucas explains that the ritual he's trying to perform isn't to bring about the lonely, but instead to prevent the extinction from ever coming into being. There are two entities that have never attempted the ritual, one being a web, because the world is already just right for the web to exist in, and the other being the end, because all things die eventually, and thus there's no need to speed up the process. The extinction would be different. An entity that actively seeks out the destruction of humanity could fuck up the system for the rest of the entities, and thus he needs Martin's help to stop it. Martin also reveals that since the attack from the Flesh, he made a deal with Peter Lucas. He'd become Lucas's assistant, and in return, Lucas would protect the archives from further threats. I've got to level with you, I don't believe Lucas here. I do believe the extinction exists, but I don't believe the line he's selling about trying to prevent it from coming into being. I just don't believe he's that altruistic. Either way, the extinction is an interesting concept, and while we aren't going to put it on the board just yet, shelve it in the back of your minds. Episode 135 is from Manuela Dominguez, the second in command of the People's Church of the Divine Host. It's her account of how she joined the church and the build-up to their attempt at their ritual, the Extinguished Sun. It's interesting, but it doesn't hold much relevant info, so we're going to skip over it real quick. The post-statement is relevant, though. John mentions how the rest of the Institute avoid him, which, at this point, to be honest, is reasonable, before the statement cuts and we switch to Elias and Bouchard having a conversation in his cell. Elias explains that he put Bouchard on a wild goose chase to allow John to go into the coffin, rescue Daisy, and develop his powers. He did all of that because he believes that the People's Church of the Divine Host are attempting the ritual again. Even though they failed recently in episode 73 thanks to Bouchard, Elias believes that due to increased activity in Nyala-Sund. Bouchard takes that info and leaves. We're going to keep going because it feels like things are snowballing, but I do believe that this is another misdirection. I don't think Elias cares about the Dark performing a ritual. To be honest, I think he wants Bouchard and potentially John out of the way so that he can do some shady shit in the archives. Anyway, I'm going to do a lightning round of episodes really quick, just to get some of the episodes with less meat on them out of the way. Episode 136 doesn't have a huge amount of relevance besides John accidentally compelling Melanie to admit she's going to therapy, which she doesn't end up really caring about, and a second mention, and it includes a second mention of Annabelle Cane, who we heard about in episode 69. Yes, nice. In both of the contexts we've heard about Annabelle Cane, she's been talked about in the same breath as spiders, which makes me think that she may be an avatar for the web, or at the very least related to it. Let's keep that in mind. In the post-statement, John and Daisy have a chat, and they seem to be on good terms since the coffin incident, and Daisy admits that she broke into Elias's office to sign an employment contract, and since then her nightmares about John have stopped. She invites him out to drinks with Bouchard, and he agrees. Episode 137 details another ritual of the slaughter and is not entirely relevant. John reveals that Daisy broke the lock to Elias's office in a subtle enough way where it hasn't been replaced. Thus, John is able to get in. Inside of Elias's office, he finds a pile of tape recorders which he theorizes Elias believed he wasn't ready for yet, and thus hid from him. He says he feels like he needs to know what the Watcher's crown is, and he feels like he's on a deadline chasing breadcrumbs. Episode 138 is a letter from Robert Smirk to Jonah Magnus. It's interesting, but the part of most relevance is the pre-statement where Martin goes to talk to Elias about the extinction. Elias confirms that it's real, but says he doesn't really care about it, and when Martin says he thinks Lucas is trying to get him to join the Lonely, Elias says that he doesn't want to interfere and that the decision is Martin's to make. At that, Martin leaves. The actual statement itself is about Robert Smirk failing to create a balance between the fears, which was a lifelong goal of his, and how, at the end of Smirk's life, he was assailed by the Eye. After the statement's over, Martin laughs about how impossible it would be to balance the powers in any way, before wishing John good luck and telling him to stay safe, as he expects John to read this statement one day. Episode 139 is about how Agnes Montague was created, how she died, and how her life was largely orchestrated by the cult of the Lightless Flame. The fact that she was actively created and didn't randomly join the cult is interesting, but it doesn't feel particularly relevant here. John mentions in the post-statement how unhappy he is to have to deal with office politics. Bouchard is out with Daisy, Melanie doesn't want to talk to him, although she does seem to be doing better, and Martin is actively avoiding him, leaving him with essentially nobody to talk to. Towards the end of the episode, John tries to just know what Peter Lucas is up to, and he fails in a way that seems to cause him a great deal of pain. Episode 140 is a recounting of what seems to be Maxwell Rayner's, quote, birth. It tells him an astronomer drowned in a pool as black as India ink, before the drowned man was reborn as someone else, who we can imagine is probably Rayner. In the post-statement, Bouchard and John talk about the potential ritual of the dark coming up soon. Bouchard tells John that, despite the information coming from Elias, although she doesn't mention him by name, she believes it. The information suggests that the People's Church are going to use Nyala-Sund as a staging area for another ritual during the winter solstice to take advantage of the 11 weeks of pitch black night. While John doubts this, Bouchard is sure and books the two of them a trip to Nyala-Sund. They're going to use Daisy's guns and John's powers offensively to stop the ritual. John asks whether anyone else will be joining them, and Bouchard says it will just be the two of them. Despite his reservations, John agrees. Episode 141 doesn't contain any relevant information, so all I'll say about it is that the two of them have boarded a ship and are sailing to Nyala-Sund, and John uses his powers to forcibly extract information from a crew member aboard the ship. Episode 142 is in the same boat, and all I'll say is that it's about a woman recounting how John, in a similar way, forcibly extracted information from her, and after the statement, Martin, who the statement was being given to, muses that John likely did it without realizing. Either way, it seems like John is somewhat losing self-control. Episode 143 is from the perspective of John and Basira as they disrupt the ritual, or more aptly, what's left of it. John and Basira have arrived at the headquarters of the People's Church of the Divine Host, and while locals say it's abandoned, John senses the dark nearby. They enter the hideout and are attacked by Manuela Dominguez. Basira manages to overpower her, and John compels her to give her statement. She explains that in 2015 they were to perform a ritual to bring about the end of the world during the eclipse. In doing so, they sacrificed the Beast of the Dark, which Manuela calls the Still and Lightless Beast, and they began the ritual with several other sites across the world. Over the next few days, several other sites were disrupted. Eventually the ritual failed, and Raina left to go find a new avatar for the Dark. Dominguez believes that Gertrude had been the one to disrupt the rituals, and is shocked when John tells her that both Gertrude and Raina are dead. Dominguez finishes by telling them that a core part of the Dark Star, is within the facility, but that only the highest level avatars of the Dark have ever been able to look upon it. John goes to look at it, and as he does, Dominguez escapes and Basira goes after her. John looks upon the star and remarks how beautiful it is, before collapsing in agony. The star shatters. After the star is destroyed, Helen appears and tells John that she's captured Manuela and, quote, plans to keep her. She gives Basira and John a shortcut back to the archives, which they gladly take. So there was clearly some deception happening here. There was no activity happening in Nyalesund, and the Dark were certainly not in a position to perform a ritual. It seems to be almost 100% confirmed that Elias is trying to get John and Basira out of the way so that Peter Lucas can perform the joint Watcher's crown. Perhaps it's narrow-minded of me, but I can't possibly imagine another reason why he'd want to get John and Basira out of London for so long. Episode 144 is another largely irrelevant one, so all I'll say about it is that it's a statement on the extinction, and after reading it, Martin snaps at Daisy to get away from him in an attempt to, quote, protect her. I feel like it's fair to say that Martin is, at this point, probably either an avatar of the Lonely or at least a puppet of it. Episode 145 is pretty funny, to be honest. It's conversation between Gertrude and Arthur Nolan, the former head of the cult of the Lightless Flame. Nolan clearly came to the archives to kill Gertrude, but was deeply unprepared and ended up getting one of the members of the cult killed, his statement extracted, and Gertrude's protections from the cult extended to Jack Barnabas, the former lover of Agnes Montague. So, essentially, he came in unprepared and lost in every aspect. I gotta be honest, it's a real shame we didn't get to see much of Gertrude. It seems like she was a real girl boss while she was alive, even though she didn't really use her Watcher powers. Maybe it's for the best we didn't see too much of her. Who knows? Episode 146's statement isn't relevant here, so we're going to skip over it. The post-statement is interesting though. John has a talk with Helen where they discuss needing to feed and whether it's possible for the web to control another avatar. Helen ultimately laughs John out of the room and suggests that it's not possible, though John clearly doesn't believe her, as in the next part of the statement, John is confronted by the rest of the cast, minus Martin, about him feeding on innocent people. Martin sent them the statement from 142, where that woman talks about John feeding on her unwillingly, and John promises the rest of the cast that he was being controlled by the web while doing so. The rest of the cast don't believe him, and Basira suggests that they go to Hilltop Road to try and find Annabelle Cane so they can get answers. While John's nervous about that, he ultimately agrees. Episode 147 begins as John, Basira, Melanie, and Daisy are investigating Hilltop Road. The house is uninhabited, and as they head upstairs, they hear John's voice. It's the first tape he ever recorded, the one on the Anglerfish. Underneath the recorder is the statement of Annabelle Cane, written on official Institute paper. She muses on free will and how it's a concept that humans only ever seem to ascribe to themselves. With every other animal, it's all about instinct and training, but when it comes to humans, they feel the need to ascribe a specific kind of freedom to themselves. Annabelle wonders if perhaps there is no free will, just a web of tiny insignificant factors that ultimately shape the world in such a way that all choices are already predetermined, but the factors determining them are so minor the human mind simply can't see them. She wonders if John even cares about free will at all. No, what he's worried about right now is whether he's choosing to continue reading this statement. When was the last time he read a statement without feeling the need to record it? Is that instinct, or is it manipulation? Annabelle doesn't know, or if she does know, she isn't willing to say. She has, however, been interfering to keep John safe or to, quote, keep things on track. She knows that John is worried about his actions not being his own, so she's left this statement here to reassure him. In keeping with tradition, Annabelle decides to leave her story with her statement. She was the youngest child of a large, wealthy family, and as she grew, she became skilled at manipulation. She knew how to lie and how to get people to fight in such a way that things always turned out in her favor. Still, she wanted more. She decided to run away from home so that her influence would be further strengthened. She packed for 2 days and 2 nights and left. She chose to spend her time at an abandoned chip shop by the beach near her home. She entered into it and fell asleep before she was awoken by the sound of tapping coming from deeper into the shop. She went in and was greeted by a young woman sat at a loom. The threads of the loom ran through her skin and dozens of spiders crawled through those holes. The woman looked at Annabelle, then up at the ceiling. Following her gaze, she saw something, though she doesn't quite say what. All we know of what she saw is that it made Annabelle flee, and in Annabelle's mind, when a spider reaches a certain size, quote, it is often not entirely made up of spider anymore. She fled home with a new phobia of spiders, which eventually caused her to sign up for the trial mentioned in episode 69. Nice. And Annabelle then wonders how much free will was involved in that incident. She didn't feel as if she was being controlled by the web, though. The web undoubtedly got what it wanted. It got a new avatar to replace Raymond Fielding. She wonders whether the web is similar to the end, resigned to not interacting with the world as it knows all will eventually work out in its favor. Maybe it has its hands in everything. Maybe Annabelle is manipulating John right now. Or maybe not. She ends her statement by telling John not to come back to Hilltop Road. John is quite shaken by what Annabelle has said, although he feels good about having another, quote, ally on his side, though he doesn't really like being important to the web in that way. John is glad to know that if he wanted to, he could stop, though he really does not want to. And after this statement, I think it's fair to replace Raymond Fielding with Annabelle Cane on the board, especially since Raymond Fielding seems to be dead. We've got another bunch of largely irrelevant statements, so we're just going to rapid fire them real quick. Episode 148 isn't terribly important besides Basira beating the fuck out of Elias for lying to her, and her telling John that unless he stops feeding on people directly, she'll kill him. John agrees, though after the statement ends, he remarks that he's feeling less and less sated by each statement he records. Episode 149 is in the same boat, so all I'll mention on it is that Martin clearly still cares about John, but Georgie and Melanie are distancing themselves from John as they can see he's on something of a path of self-destruction. Episode 150 is the same, but ends with Melanie telling John that, while she can't quit, she refuses to do her work. John is, slightly reluctantly, fine with this, and Melanie ends the episode by saying she's going to go get Daisy drunk. Episode 151 is interesting, but doesn't really contain any new information. It's the statement of Simon Fairchild, who, it turns out, is still alive, even though he's old as fuck. He was asked by Lucas to talk to Martin to try and convince him of the impending extinction apocalypse, and he does a decent job of doing so. Ultimately, Martin seems to believe him, and when Basira confronts him after Fairchild leaves, he tells Basira that he and Lucas are trying to prevent the apocalypse. Basira doesn't actually believe him, but she ultimately agrees to stay out of Martin and Lucas's way, and to not tell John about their conversation. We're going to skip episode 152's statement and go straight into the post-statement as John has a conversation with Helen. They talk about Jane Prentiss and her worm door from all the way back in season 1, and Helen wonders whether it may have been an attempt at a ritual. It ultimately failed because Prentiss failed to find Leitner, Gertrude, or the center of the labyrinth, which in Helen's words, contains a delightful surprise. John wonders whether the center of the labyrinth might be a universal blind spot for all the powers, as he can't see what's there. They further discuss the morality of, and Helen tells John that while she felt guilty at first, she gave up on that feeling when she realized it wasn't going to stop her from feeding. John asks her when the eye will reduce him to an emotionless monster, and Helen laughs. That was never on the agenda. John's feelings have never stopped him from feeding, and so the eye doesn't care about his feelings at all. He can keep his feelings as is, because in the end, they have no meaning other than maybe acting as seasoning. Same situation with episode 153. After the statement, Julia Montauk and Trevor Herbert break into the Institute with the intent to kill John for destroying Gerard's page. They're about to do that before Daisy appears and convinces them to leave. After that, John asks why Daisy isn't feeding the hunt, and she tells him that, after her experience in the Buried, she's realized that even if it kills her, she does not want to go back to being a monster. Episode 154 is the statement of Eric Delano, the husband of Mary Keay and the father of Gerard Keay. His ghost has a conversation with Gertrude where he explains how he met Mary, fell in love with her, became complicit in the evils of the eye, and ultimately left the Institute before being killed by Mary as his usefulness had passed. At the end of the statement, Gertrude burns his page and releases his spirit, in the same way John did to Gerard, but not before Delano reveals that the only way to free yourself from the Institute is to cut out your eyes. We cut immediately to post-statement as John bursts into Martin's office, begging him to gouge out his eyes and leave the Institute with him. Martin, despite everything that's happening, refuses and tells John that he's only asking because he wants someone to anchor himself to. He wants a reason to keep on living once he's left the Institute. John remarks that the lonely has its claws in Martin and that if he ever needs somebody to talk to, John will be there for him. The episode ends with John taking the revelation to the rest of the cast and ultimately deciding not to blind himself, at least not for the time being. We're going to keep going since we're approaching not only the end of season 4, but also the end of the entire show, but first, let me point out that we're only 5 episodes away from the end of the season, and nothing major appears to be happening, which is making me a bit nervous. Episode 155 begins with John explaining to Daisy and Basira how to leave the Institute. Though neither of them seem particularly interested, Basira is trying to convince Daisy to hunt Trevor and Julia, but Daisy's completely against it. She's made peace with the fact that she's going to die, and still refuses to hunt. The statement is largely unimportant, and the episode ends with Melanie leaving the Institute. She's decided that no price is too great, and she tells John that she's already left her letter of resignation with Lucas. John offers to help blind her, and she tells him that she doesn't need any help in that regard. She only asks that he calls an ambulance in 5 minutes. Melanie is free. I am deeply happy for her, and I do feel like this is a good end to her character. Like, her getting out of the Institute and finally being free of the does feel satisfying. It does feel like a satisfying end to her character. Episode 156 ramps things up as, after Martin records a statement, Peter Lucas appears. He tells Martin that he's taking him to the center of the tunnels beneath the archives, and Martin realizes Lucas intends to have him use whatever's down there. Martin asks Lucas if he'll be back, and Lucas tells him that he won't be coming back, though he won't die either. I think we're about to see the Joint Watcher's crown. Let's keep going, folks. Let's keep going. Episode 157 begins with John listening to the end of episode 156. He wonders who left the statement for him, whether it was Lucas trying to coerce him, Annabelle trying to manipulate him, or Martin asking for help. John sits to record one final statement before going into the tunnels to get Martin. It's a statement from Adelard Decker regarding the extinction. He recounts how he traced it to a town and ultimately found that what was there wasn't the extinction, but the corruption. He found John Amherst there, and he killed him by burying him in 4 feet of concrete, though not before Amherst managed to infect him. Decker ends the statement by sending it to Gertrude via email, burning the town down and ending his own life, happy in the knowledge that he served his god well. And that's the Christian god, not one of the entities. John is shaken by the statement as he believes it's Martin telling John that he doesn't believe in the extinction and he just wants help. He decides to go get a second opinion and goes to Georgie's apartment to find Melanie. Georgie won't let him in, and John ultimately realizes that the two of them are dating. John and Georgie's bickering wakes both the Admiral and Melanie, who ultimately welcomes John as a friend. Despite that, she tells him she can't help him right now, and John leaves after realizing that he can't drag Melanie back into it. John then goes to Helen and tries to compel her to tell him what's at the center of the tunnels. She refuses, saying that it'll be more fun if she doesn't, and when John actually tries to compel her, she tells him that, should he follow through with the compelling, only one of them will survive. The episode ends with Helen encouraging John to feed before he goes deeper so that he'll be stronger for the bad things that are about to come. Episode 158, Panopticon. We've arrived at the beginning of the end of season 4. Martin and Lucas are walking through the tunnels and making gentle conversation. Lucas reveals to Martin that he has the 7 Lamps of Architecture, the book that Leitner used to trap the anglerfish. Lucas then releases the anglerfish, who runs off to, quote, take care of unfinished business. Lucas tells Martin that Martin could stop the anglerfish if he wanted, but Martin doesn't. He doesn't care. He's pretty much lost all sight of what he's here for. Another tape recorder clicks back on. Daisy and Basira explain to John that Elias just walked out of jail with no resistance, and John is absolutely bewildered. He then puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that the tape left on his desk in 157 was left there by Elias. He now knows that Elias is back in the Institute and they need to go get Martin. We switch back to Martin and Lucas as they're reaching the center of the tunnels. Lucas tells Martin that they're now at the center of Millbank Prison, a site of power for the lonely in the eye to learn more about the extinction. Before any of that can happen, Martin needs to dispose of the current occupant. Martin then sees the body of Jonah Magnus, the man who founded the Institute, strung up, and Martin realizes that he's there to kill him. Martin asks, his voice trembling, where Jonah Magnus's eyes are. Elias appears and tells Martin that Jonah's eyes are right where they've always been, watching over his institute. Elias is Jonah. We cut to John, Daisy, and Basira as they find a tape reading Play Me. Though Daisy and Basira think they don't have enough time to do so, John insists and plays it. It's the recording of Gertrude's death. Elias catches her sloshing gasoline around as she prepares to burn down the archives. She had planned to do it as the Dark performed their ritual, burning the archives to further distract Elias before going after Jonah's body and destroying her eyes to survive what would essentially be the death of her patron. She tells Elias to make a move, to either stop her or to leave. Before she can even finish her sentence, a gunshot rings out and Gertrude dies, her final words being that she thought death would hurt more. The three now know that Elias is Jonah, and as the tape recorder clicks off, they hear screaming and Basira leaves to check it out. The tape clicks on as Martin wonders whether killing Elias, who we'll call Jonah from now on, would destroy the archives. Jonah isn't sure of that, but he is sure that doing so would not be pleasant for Martin, and would certainly not be pleasant for John. Lucas expresses that Martin is like him now, he's part of the lonely, and he'll like being alone, unjudged and silent. Martin, at that point, laughs. He would like to kill Jonah, but he won't, despite Lucas telling him to. John's recorder clicks back on. Trevor and Julia have made a return, and at the same time, the anglerfish has reappeared. John needs to get to Martin, but there's no way, but at the end of her time and a rope, Daisy allows the hunt to reclaim her, asking Basira to come and kill her once it's all over. Basira promises that she will. John runs as Daisy leaps forwards to kill the interlopers. We cut to Martin as Lucas further implores Martin to kill Jonah. Martin won't though, he doesn't care. He was never part of the lonely. He knew that Lucas was playing him, that stopping the extinction was never the goal, and so he played Lucas in return. He told him what he wanted to hear so that Lucas wouldn't focus on John. Lucas, enraged, casts Martin into the lonely as Jonah mocks him for losing their bet. Jonah tells him to leave the door to the lonely open. As this happens, John enters the panopticon and meets Jonah, who tells John that he found the panopticon because he was called. He tells John what just happened, and John, despite his fear, resolves to enter the lonely to get Martin. Jonah tells him that he likely won't return if he does so, but John doesn't care. Jonah, before the recording, tells John to know where Martin is and follow that route. Episode 159 picks up as John enters the lonely, calling out to Martin. Lucas's voice taunts him, telling him that Martin doesn't want to be found. Eventually, John realizes that Lucas doesn't have enough power to force him out, and, pushing his way through the lonely, finds Martin. Martin wonders aloud why John came for him, and John begs him to leave, though Martin refuses. The lonely feels right. To him, nothing hurts there. Martin, at the end of it all, admits that he loved John, though he isn't sure if that matters now. As he says that, he disappears. Lucas appears and further taunts John, trying to convince him to stay in the lonely. Just as John seems to agree, Lucas materializes and John turns, compelling him to give a statement. Lucas tells his story. He grew up in a big house with a big family. Though he had no father, he had several siblings and a loving mother. His mother loved them all. So much. That was why Lucas was sure that when his siblings disappeared one by one, his mother had not killed them. As Lucas grew, he ran away from home often. He'd walk through the streets for days on end, cursing the few people he'd walk by, begging them to disappear until one day one of them did. When he returned home, he found his family waiting for him. They took him to the basement where he met their god. He'd been an acolyte and an avatar of the lonely ever since. He describes meeting Adelard Daka, finding out about the extinction and hating it. He recalls thinking that, should he be able to perform a ritual to bring the lonely into existence, the extinction would never come into being. He resolved to perform that ritual, though he was ultimately thwarted by Gertrude Robinson. Though he had lost it all, he had gotten a taste of the game and was thus easily convinced by Jonah to take over the archives with Martin, who seemed easily convertible, as his prize. Lucas ends it all by stating that Jonah had won and that his prize was John. John tries to get him to explain what that means and what Jonah wants from John, but Lucas refuses and is killed by the compulsion. John then finds Martin, who still refuses to leave. Fuck me, man. After begging, John ultimately tells Martin to look at him. Martin does so, and as he sees John, he cries tears of joy. They leave the lonely, and the episode ends. Martin and John leave to one of Daisy's safe houses in Scotland following the events of the Panopticon. A couple of weeks have passed, and Basira has managed to send them a few tapes to make sure that John doesn't die of starvation. Martin leaves John to read as the statement begins. It's from Hazel Rutter regarding a fire in her childhood home. But that's a lie. It's from Jonah Magnus regarding the archivist. Jonah lays his ambitions bare. This is the end of the world. He will condemn everything to an eternity of suffering for immortality and power, and he feels no regret. That choice is the best he will ever make. What set him on this path? He learnt of the entities from Robert Smark alongside some other scholars, and watched as those others felt the influence of the entities. Smark feared one of them would complete a ritual and sought to stop that. Jonah, remaining ever faithful, helped Smark, though privately he knew the only way to stop a ritual from being completed was to complete his own first. He convinced Smark to build Millbank Prison as a temple not only to the eye, but to all entities. He modified the Panopticon, and, over the years, the fear of its prisoners seeped into it and granted him the power to attempt the Watcher's crown. He tried, and it failed. Nobody interfered, it just failed. Despite that failure, Jonah gained some sort of omniscience and endeavored to try again, moving the Institute to above the prison. Over the years, he body-swapped to stay alive, all while preventing rituals and observing their failures to try and understand why his went so wrong. Eventually, Gertrude came to be the archivist, and things started to change. Where others were single-minded in recording statements, she was single-minded in stopping rituals, and she did so with immense efficiency. Eventually, the two of them, Jonah and Gertrude, realized that there was not some cosmic reason why all rituals failed, but that performing a single ritual was impossible altogether. The two of them made no effort to stop the Dark's ritual, and it simply failed on its own. Jonah then realized what the issue was. Performing a ritual to a single entity was impossible. They just overlapped too much. To bring about the end of the world, he would need to summon all 14 fears at once. With this in mind, he began to devise a new ritual to bring them all through at once. The key to that would be the archivist, who would serve as a living record of terror. To complete the ritual, Jonah needed the archivist to be marked by all fears in both body and mind. This could be done by feeding them the necessary statements, but doing so would be too long and too slow. Instead, Jonah decided to make that archivist go through a trial by fire. He killed Gertrude and made John the new archivist. He was perfect in a way, already marked by the web. When Prentiss attacked, he allowed the worms to burrow into John to mark the corruption into him. Then when the Anglerfish attacked, Jonah allowed him to have a close encounter so that he could be marked by the stranger. And he allowed Helen to be captured by Micheal so that John could meet the spiral and be marked by it. He then allowed John to meet Jude Perry, who marked his flesh with desolation. He allowed Daisy to almost kill John, marking him with the hunt. He allowed Micheal Crew to send John to the vast, marking him with that. When Melanie became an avatar of the slaughter in India, Jonah took advantage of that by binding her to the archives. She would later mark John during her surgery. He was then marked by the end during his encounter with Oliver and his coma. Only 4 remained: the dark, the flesh, the buried, and the lonely. Jonah pushed Hopsworth to attack the archives, which then resulted in his being marked by the flesh, and John's subsequent rescue of Daisy left him marked by the buried. He observed the dark star and it cast darkness into his mind leaving him marked, before he finally went to rescue Martin, marking him with the lonely. The web, the eye, the corruption, the stranger, the spiral, the desolation, the hunt, the vast, the slaughter, the flesh, the buried, the dark, and the lonely. John is the record. The eye's power dwells within him, and it squirms, ready for the world to be remade in its image. All that's left is the incantation.
Now, repeat after me. You who watch and know and understand none. You who listen and hear and will not comprehend. You who wait and drink in all that is not yours by right. Come to us in your wholeness. Come to us in your perfection. Bring all that is fear, and all that is terror, and all that is the awful dread that crawls and chokes and blinds and falls and twists and leaves and hides and weaves and burns and hunts and rips and bleeds and dies. Come to us. I open the door!
This is what I've been waiting for. This is the moment that justifies all of my criticisms of the show, all of my fears about it falling flat. This is it. This is, to me, the single greatest ending of a season I've ever witnessed. Despite it all, despite the trials and the sacrifices and the victories and the losses, it's still over. Elias won. I mean, what else is there to say? This show has stuck with me for years because of this moment, because of just how overwhelmingly grim it is. And things will only get worse from here. That is just such a testament to how horrid the ending of this show is, to how overwhelmingly cruel it is. Even if you don't listen to the show, I implore you, go listen to episode 160. I showed a part of it in this video, but please go listen to it. Please. It's really incredible. It's really incredible. Episode 161 picks up days later as John, now having fully lost his humanity and having taken on the form of the archivist, listens and re-listens and re-listens to a tape Jonah sent him. It's of his birthday, the only one that he got to celebrate with the cast. They eat cake and they drink wine and have fun, but it's gone now. John turns it off as Martin enters and tells him not to listen to it. He believes Jonah sent it to them to taunt them. He's probably right. There's another tape, one of Gertrude. She begins by telling the archivist that if they're listening to it, she's dead. She hopes that the archivist listening is Sasha James, but she can't be sure. Whoever it is, they need to know that everything is a lie. Elias is a lie, the archives are a lie, God is a lie, and the rest of their lives will be truly terrible, but that doesn't mean their lives have to be without meaning. She lays the truth out, the entities, the avatars, their role, and Jonah's deception. It never reached the archivist. The recording clicks off. Martin wants to leave. They're still in the safe house, and it is still safe, but for how long, we can't be sure. John is lost. He caused this, and he has no way to get it back to how it was. John's lost all hope. He caused this, and there's no way to get it back. He loves Martin, and what he wants right now is just to stay in this cabin, this isolated place of safety, until both of them wither away and die. Martin implores John to leave, but he's just not ready. And so Martin gives John some space and some more time as John sits to record more statements. Gertrude catches Gerard snooping through her stationery, looking for a way to burn a Leitner. She chides him for thinking of burning it in the archives and sends him away to do so, though not before a quick conversation. Gerard wonders what would happen if an entity were to fully manifest, and Gertrude says that she doesn't know, though she thinks they'd likely be able to rewrite reality and add or change the rules of nature, keeping humanity forever alive and forever terrified. An analogy to this would be I have no mouth and I must scream, though perhaps that's a video for another day. Gerard asks if it would be possible to reverse the change once it happened, and Gertrude tells him that it wouldn't be. John rewinds that line over and over and over and over again. Things are stuck this way now, and it's his fault. Back in the archives, Tim and Sasha gossip about their colleagues. Tim's sure that Sasha's more than qualified for the role of the archivist, and she agrees. Tim is sure that the only reason John got the promotion over her is sexist prejudice from Elias. Tim then suggests she say something, but Sasha refuses. She considers getting a different job, but she ends up staying, likely because Tim and Martin really have nowhere else to go. The conversation then turns to Gertrude. Tim believes the archives are a mess because she was losing it in her old age, but Sasha, who spoke to Gertrude on multiple occasions, knows that to be untrue. She kept it messy because she knew it would hurt Elias. The tape ends and John talks. The cabin he's in is cozy and calm. Though he knows it to be false, the comfort of its walls is alluring nonetheless. Inside, he can ignore the screams. The cabin begs him to stay wrapped in its warm embrace until they wither and merge with the walls and live in eternal undeath, wrapped in a cloying comfort that refuses change. John knows the Eye wishes him to stay, and because of that, he will leave. Martin enters and John tells him of his change of heart. When he spoke into that tape, all of his hatred of Jonah and himself and the Eye and the world just poured into it, and he felt okay. He now knows that he's ready to leave. Though Martin is confused, he's happy, and though the journey will be long and will take as much from them as it can, Martin has been ready for a long time. They don't know if there's any way to reverse the change, but they'll have to find out for themselves. The two have been walking for hours and hours, and though Martin knows he should be tired, he isn't. He tells John they should find a car or something to make the journey faster, but John explains that space no longer matters. The journey, the pilgrimage, will take as long as it needs to. No vehicle will help that. There's a tower in the distance, the Archives. It's merged with the Panopticon, and though they were hundreds of miles from it when the change happened, it can now be seen from anywhere on Earth, and it in turn can see them too. They're already deep in the horrors. Without realizing it, they've arrived at trenches of endless blood and dirt and terror. As John begins to empty himself of the fear filling him, Martin begs him to stop, wanting to take no part in what he's about to hear. John can't stop himself, but he won't stop Martin from covering his ears. The trench is endless, the frontier of a war with no name, no past, and no future. Charlie finds himself in a vessel and watches as his friend Ryan dies in a hail of bullets. But Ryan can't fall, he can't rest, his body is packed too tight with the bodies of others to fall to the ground. He remains standing, and Charlie watches in horror as he waits for another bullet to claim his life too. He's on a helicopter now, he's strapped in and unable to move, unable to hear the cries of his fellow soldiers over the rotors, and unable to hear himself as a rocket hurtles towards them. He's in the wreckage. A drone circles above him, watching him as he tries to crawl away. He knows that it'll fire upon him soon enough, and all he can do is crawl as barbed wire snakes its way around him, digging eagerly into his flesh. He cannot move as a tank rolls over him. There's a man next to Alexei. A blood-red flower sits on his lapel, and he shakes Alexei by the hand. Alexei's a good man, willing to risk his life to go to war like that. Dying for your country is the most noble thing one can do. Alexei doesn't want to fight, but as he turns to run, the man plucks Alexei's heart and slots it neatly into his wallet. As Alexei falls down dead, Charlie wakes. There's a battle coming. There's more war to fight. John and Martin are still walking, wading through water. Martin's fallen behind and stops as he hears a payphone start to ring. Martin knows it's for him, but he chooses not to answer, and for now, that's a wise choice. The two pass through a village overtaken by rot and paranoia, and as they come out on the other side, Martin asks John if they might be infected after their trip through the village, but John reassures him. He just knows they aren't. Martin wonders if John now knows everything and asks him some questions to test his limits. He asks John where Basira is, and he's told that she's alive and not trapped in a nightmare. She's looking for Daisy, who remains bestial and carves her way through other domains. Basira plans to kill Daisy, but doesn't know if she can go through with it. John doesn't know what happens after that. The future is off limits to him. How much longer do they have to go? A long and painful way. John believes Melanie and Georgie are alive and possibly in London, but he doesn't know exactly where. Jonah is in the Panopticon, and is also in London. He can't exactly see where, but he knows Jonah can see him. Are they safe? Yes. John brought about this apocalypse, and thus the fears won't touch their messiah, nor his companion, no matter how close they get. Who was calling on that phone just now? Annabelle Cane, though John can't quite see where she is. Final question, can they turn the world back? If the fears were removed, the world would go back to normal, but while there are people to fear them, they cannot disappear. John stops there, remarking that looking deeper into the entities is like staring at the sun. Final question, where's Helen nowadays? John finds that one funny, as Helen is, and always has been, right behind them. She greets them through her door. She's just there to check up on the happy couple. Though she's delighted at how the world has turned out, she can take no claim on how it got here. That was all John. Martin suggests she take them to the Panopticon through her tunnels, but Helen won't. John's too powerful for her now, and if he entered her tunnels, it would end quite badly for her. She concludes by saying that, as much as she enjoys their company, she has to take her leave. They're on a merry-go-round now, though Orsinov is dead, someone familiar still remains. John muses on the unreality they're in before he spots the anglerfish, the thing that started it all. It taunts the two, but John knows it can't actually touch them. It's ruled by the eye now. As they turn to leave, the anglerfish, furious, taunts them with Sasha's voice. John turns to it, and in a blaze of fury and terror, he forces the feeling of fear and horror of all her victims into the creature's mind. With a final roar, he forces the ceaseless watcher to gaze upon the creature, and, with a final eruption of agony, the anglerfish is obliterated. Martin is deeply impressed by the display, but John is not happy. He isn't sure what's going to happen to the merry-go-round now that its ruler is dead, and he does not want to stick around to find out. Martin still wants to know how John killed the anglerfish, and Helen appears. She explains to him that while all the fears rule, the Eye is the king of kings. There are two roles in the world now, the Watcher and the Watched. For a creature whose entire existence has been watching, to suddenly feel the fear of being watched destroys them entirely. That is why the anglerfish died. John is ashamed. He feels that he's been rewarded for ending the world. He gets to walk through this sea of horrors, indulge in the delight the eye rewards him with, and kill whoever he despises. He's ashamed that he enjoyed killing the anglerfish and that he wants to hurt more. John is surprised to hear that Martin is actually all in favor of killing here. From his perspective, the world is over and some things are evil and plain deserve to die. Before they can continue their conversation, the phone rings. It's Annabelle Cane again. John walks away to give him some privacy, and Martin picks it up and demands to know who it is, but the person on the other end won't confirm. The call concludes as the voice asks Martin if he's sure that John even needs him. John and Martin continue as John asks what Cane's call was about. Martin tells him not to know, and though John protests, he eventually agrees not to know anything about Martin unless he's in immediate danger. The two share a break in a quiet conversation where John tacitly admits that yes, Martin is his reason to keep going. These bitches gay? Good for them, good for them. They enter into the domain of the end, and John teases Martin about being jealous as Martin tells him to kill Oliver Banks. Eventually Martin acquiesces and moves on as John takes a statement. Oliver's report on the end of the world. All his vision is obscured by endless suffering and the joy given to him by the end, but he knows one thing for certain. Humans are not born here, they can only ever die. They will die slowly, ever so slowly, but once they do die, they do not come back. That means the world will end gently after years of endless torment. Oliver doesn't mind being killed by John. John can do whatever he wants. There's no reason to fight, as in the end everything dies. John finishes and resolves not to kill Oliver, taking solace in the fact that things will end no matter what. The two enter into the domain of desolation, an endless burning building with no escape. John resolves to go inside, despite the fact that it will hurt a lot, as Jude Perry is inside and he wants to kill her. Eventually the two meet Perry, and she forces John to confess that as much as he doesn't want to, he enjoys taking in the suffering happening in the building. As she's forced to take in the feelings of all she's hurt, she begs but cannot convince John. With her final words, she curses John. He's no better than her. She's right, but she's still gone. Despite her death, the fire continues to rage. Little has changed. Martin is alone. He sits in uncomfortable chairs, breathing in mildew from old books. He fancies his new boss, but he doesn't think his boss cares for him. They need to be quiet so as to not wake his mum. He knows he's doing something wrong, and as always thinks of his mum's face, though he hasn't been able to remember what she looked like for quite a long time. He remembers other people being in the house with him. They were grey, faded, and forgotten. He's not sure if there's anyone out there who actually cares about him. Then he remembers John. He knows John, and he knows John cares about him, and he clings to that memory and forges his way through the fog. They're in the lonely, and John tells Martin that should he want to stay here and forget it all, he would not stop him and would not blame him. Martin admits that while staying here and being forgotten would be comforting, it would not be the good kind of comfort. It would be the kind of comfort that leaves you daydreaming about nothing. Martin was once part of the lonely, but he is not it, and it is not him. They continue. They're in a garden, and it is beautiful, but not in a kind way. It's one of flesh and bone, one that grows people into grotesque shapes that do not resemble what they should look like at all. It's ruled by Gerard Hopsworth. He dismissively asks John if Martin's his boyfriend, and John confirms that yes, he is. Gerard believes that John's here to kill him, and though he believes he could get a few hits in first if he tried, Martin asks him not to. Gerard agrees, but requests he be allowed to talk about his flowers first. John allows him to. Each was once a person, someone deeply tortured. They were forced to grow into the worst aspects of themselves under crushing conditions, and only in these circumstances can the flowers reach their full potential. Gerard has many. To say he loves them would not be right. He finds the flowers beautiful, but he doesn't love them. As he finishes, you wonder if John likes his garden too. Before he can find an answer, he is destroyed by the ceaseless watcher. Martin is frankly shocked Gerard's death wasn't messier. The garden remains unchanged, and as they continue, Martin asks why they didn't go after Arthur Nolan, who was also in the Desolations domain. John admits that he didn't want to put Martin through any more pain, and that he just didn't hate Nolan in the same way he hated Perry. Martin asks if they're doing anything good, and John doesn't know if that was ever an option. They find their way into the web's domain and watch as a play is performed. As John begins to watch the second half, Martin snaps him out of it, and the two wonder if the web is still manipulating them. John can see that the web has a plan, but it's too intricate for him to understand. That seems to be a motif of the eye at this point, knowing without understanding. They find themselves in a domain of the dark. They're greeted by Callum Brody, the boy transformed into an avatar by Rayner in 2017. He rules this place now, and though Martin begs John to make things better, John knows he simply can't. They keep walking. They meet Fairchild in a domain of the vast, and Martin begs John to kill him. John hesitates, and in the end Fairchild gets away. Martin rants in frustration as Helen appears and chides John for not metaphysically exploding an old man. After that, Martin begins to think that perhaps encouraging John to go on a murder spree might not have been the best idea, and concedes before the two continue on with their journey. As the two continue, they discuss if the extinction was real. John remarks that it was, in the sense that it was something people were afraid of, though he's not sure if it was at the point of becoming an entity or if it could have ever reached that point, not that that particularly matters now. Martin wonders if the world would have ended even if John hadn't brought the entities through, and John says that it could have. It's impossible to say. Things would have gotten very bad and lots of people would have died. Still, humanity would have survived, but even then they all would die eventually. All things end. Martin asks John if there's any truth to the human religions they left behind, but John doesn't know. He only knows that we're terrified of the answer. As the two continue, John reveals that Basira and Daisy are nearby, and though Martin's excited to see them, even given the circumstances, John is unsure. They continue nonetheless. The two are in the domain of the hunt. Thrives on fear and division and turning predators into prey. As the two walk, Trevor Herbert leaps out of the bushes and grabs Martin, putting a knife to his throat and demanding that John talk, saying he'll kill Martin if he tries to compel. But John knows that Trevor can't really kill Martin. He could if he was a hunter, but he's not. Julia was killed by Daisy and now he's prey. He wants to make John feel the same loss he did, but he's incapable of doing so. John apologizes for, in the end, reducing Trevor to something lower than prey. That being bait. Basira ends Trevor's life by putting a bullet through his head. She then holds the duo at gunpoint and demands they prove who they say they are. After a short but tense conversation, she realizes they really are who they say they are, and the three continue deeper into the forest of the hunt. The three emerge into a domain of the spiral, during which Martin and John catch Basira up on what happened and how John caused the end of the world. She doesn't seem to blame him too much and tells the two that she was in the archives when the world ended, which she believes shielded her from the initial effects. Since then, she's been tracking Trevor Herbert, hoping he'd lead her to Daisy so she could finish her promise. As she finishes, Helen appears and offers Basira a shortcut through her doors to Daisy. Basira declines, and Helen, saddened by that. The three continue, and as they talk, Basira's goal of killing Daisy is further reinforced. He settles on killing Daisy once and for all, but not after John tells her that, as she is right now, Daisy is happy. The three find her playing with her latest victim. As they split hairs on what they're going to do, Daisy lunges forwards and slashes John's leg. As she does so, she recognizes Basira and asks her to join the hunt. Basira fulfills her promise and kills Daisy. Despite Martin's protests, she stays behind to burn Daisy's body. The remaining two have reached an necropolis, inside of which is a house. It remains untouched by the powers, and as they reach it, they're greeted by Annabelle Cane, who leads them to Mikaele Salesa, perhaps the last man who remains untouched by the powers. As the two enter the house, they collapse, exhausted, their humanity returning, if only for a time. The two awake 71 hours later and have a chat with Salesa. Despite how much he dislikes Cane, he believes he could not force her to leave even if he tried. Besides, when her plans destroy his bubble of safety, he wants her to kill him quickly. He tells them of how he prepared for the apocalypse, spending many years acquiring a broken camera that could hide him from the entities and faking his death while he was at it, and how he plans to enjoy his retirement inside while the world ends. Though Salesa offers safe haven, the two have to leave as John grows increasingly unresponsive and sickly the longer he stays within. They venture out. As they're split, Martin's ego collapses as he's forced to face the fact that he is still one of the lonely and he still causes others harm. He accepts that, despite that being fact, he will not look. Looking would feed him, and he does not want to gain from the pain he's causing others. John meets Helen in a labyrinth of doors and portals, and, well, John doesn't want to meet Helen because he fears he may have to kill her, and he doesn't want to do so. Despite that reluctance to kill her, he resents her for taking the actual Helen Richardson, even if it was to save him. He wants to know if she was working with Jonah, and though she denies it, he does not believe her. Though she's powerless before John, she doesn't want the change to be reversed. As John reflects on the distortion and its lies, he and Helen meet a woman looking for her son. Though Helen tries to help her, John reveals to her that her son is not here and that Helen is the woman tormenting her. As she screams, John begins to understand that Helen is too dangerous to be left alive, that she fought to undermine and strengthen John as his doubt fed her. As he unravels her, she begins to change, begging for her life, but John is not merciful, and the unending lie unravels as it's faced with the unending gaze of the ceaseless watcher. As the two continue, John remarks that the destruction of Helen gave the eye a lot of fear, It would seem that John not only destroyed Helen, but the spiral as a whole. That's not shocking, the spiral was a lie, something unable to be known. It's like that saying, what happens when an immovable object meets an unstoppable force? Who knows? In this instance, the unstoppable force overcame the immovable object, and the twisting lie of the spiral was destroyed. Though perhaps that too is a lie. As the two ponder, they realize they're about to enter London proper, the seat of the Eye. Things are almost at an end already. As the two prepare to end things, John begins to get cold feet. He has no idea what's actually happening in the Panopticon, and he gets the feeling that things might just come down to whether the Eye chooses him or Jonah. Martin's becoming increasingly frustrated with this attitude as he feels John is just giving up. As he storms off, John records a statement on the Eye, and once he's done, Martin comes back all smiles. He drags John into the sewers, where John immediately weakens as he's cut off from the Eye. Still, that matters little in the face of what they find down there. Melanie and Georgie are still alive. The two manage to survive the change completely unharmed because of Georgie's immunity to fear and Melanie's immunity to the Eye, and they led a group of survivors into the sewers where they unintentionally seemed to have started a cult. Though the two don't seem particularly happy to see John and Martin, they take them in nonetheless and go deeper into the sewers. John and Martin spend a few days with Melanie and Georgie as the two consider their next move. They ultimately resolve to destroy the Eye no matter what, even if that means John will be lost alongside it. John promises not to destroy himself at the first opportunity, and the two embrace. We cut to Melanie and Georgie. Georgie's just visited the Admiral, who now lives in a domain of the Hunt, forever hunting smaller animals. It's not entirely safe for him, but it's far safer than remaining outside, and despite his not remembering her, Georgie believes that the Admiral is happier in there than he would be out here. The two discuss what to do, and Melanie ultimately comes to the conclusion that she just really dislikes John. She's sick of being told to empathize with him, and she just never wants to see him again. Despite that, he's almost certainly their best bet when it comes to ending this whole thing, so they choose to help him find a way into the archives. Georgie leads them to the steps of the Panopticon before leaving them. It's too dangerous for her to go any further. The two make their way into the Panopticon and are greeted by Rosie, Jonah's assistant and the archives receptionist. She tells them that they can't meet Jonah yet and that they need an appointment to see him. As the two wait, John scours Rosie's memory, searching for her fear. He hates her job, she hates the feeling of being watched, and she hates Jonah. But above all, she hates the thought of things getting worse, and so here she is. As John finishes her statement, she returns and tells the two they have an appointment. As they go up to his office, they find Jonah Magnus in his chair. He is the conduit through which all fear and pain arrive in the world. His torment is, to him, no doubt glorious. As John searches for answers, he arrives at the memory of Elias, trapped within Jonah. He's forever trapped in that interview he gave to get his position at the archives. Eventually he was taken over. John realizes that he could destroy Jonah if he tried, but if he did that, the Eye would take a new pupil, and that would likely be John. John believes that's what the Eye wants. John considers becoming the pupil, as it would give him a chance to perhaps reshape the world into something fairer, though Martin completely forbids it. Midway through their argument, John storms off, and Martin leaves for the hideout. After John finishes a statement on the Eye, he returns to the hideout before realizing that Martin left with Annabelle Cane. She killed Salesa and took his camera, so he can't be sure where they are, but he believes they're at Hilltop Road. As he travels to Hilltop Road, he sails across an inky black abyss before finally seeing an island in the distance. On that island is Basira. John catches her up to date and tells her where he's going. She decides to go with him, and the two continue. We cut to Annabelle Cane and Martin walking to Hilltop Road. As the two approach, Cane explains what the house is to him. It's a crack in space and time, a place where different realities cross over and intermingle. We saw that in episode 114. Finally, Annabelle admits that she's been puppeteering the cast and that the goals of the mother of puppets are about to come to fruition. Finally, she binds Martin with tape from the tape recorders and awaits John's arrival. As John and Basira arrive at Hilltop Road, Cane dangles Martin over the abyss so that when John immediately tries to kill her, she has leverage to stop him. Doing so would kill Martin after all. Besides, Martin came here of his own free will. Cane now explains the web's plan. This post-change world will last maybe millennia, but not forever. And out of all the entities, there are only two that understand this. The End, by the way of its very nature, and the Web, the only avatar with true sentience. The Eye can see, but only the Web can understand. John may be an avatar of the Eye, but he is a puppet of the Web. He was brought here to pry this crack in space and time open, and let the entities pour out into all surrounding universes. The cast are able to blow up the Panopticon and the pupil at the same time, the entities would be dragged through the crack and the world would revert. However, in doing so, the cast would doom all other realities. There is only one man who can do this, though. John. He holds both the web lighter and the power of the Ceaseless Watcher. Annabelle, having given John the information he needs to bring her plan to fruition, flees and releases Martin. As the three arrive back in London, there are now 3 choices to be made. Listen to Cane, destroy the Panopticon and Jonah and bring the world back to where it was, while dooming all other realities. Have mercy, allow John to become the pupil so he can try and bring about a more equitable hell while they wait. Allow the world to burn itself out. Allow the end to eventually reclaim all and spare the infinite other humans and all realities from the hell they're in now. The 5 argue for a while before they eventually settle on Cane's plan. Dooming all other realities does not necessarily mean that those realities would face the same hell they're facing now. They would simply have the chance to fight and win with the possibility of losing. John wants to cut the fears off now, but the others point out there's no guarantee the fears are from this dimension. This could be one of an infinite number that have already been corrupted. Still, John can't allow them to escape even if there's a chance they're from here. But he's one of 5, and the other 4 are in agreement. As John leaves in frustration to smoke, he's accompanied by Georgie. He gives her his lighter to hang on to, and she apologizes for forcing him to go along with a plan he hates, and leaves as Martin arrives. John apologizes for not agreeing, and Martin tells him that he cannot possibly imagine making a decision that would lose John. John refuses that. He caused the apocalypse, and he feels that he should pay. As he tears up, taking on that relentless guilt, Martin holds him. They take a moment and head back down. Melanie and Bouchard have scouted out the Institute and have a plan. Melanie and Georgie will sneak to the gas main that could blow up the Panopticon, while Bouchard distracts the creatures guarding it. They'll destroy it, and once they smell gas, they'll light it and hope it destroys the Panopticon. Meanwhile, John and Martin will sneak into the Panopticon and enter Jonah's office. Martin will kill Jonah, as he believes that if John killed him, he'd simply become the pupil. They finish up and decide to get some rest. John approaches Jonah in the Panopticon. Martin is not with him. As he approaches John, the pupil drops to the ground. He tells John that he's been having the most marvelous dream. John tells Jonah that it's over, that he's ending the world and killing the entities once and for all. Jonah panics and spends his final few moments afraid as John stabs him again and again, for Sasha, for Tim, for Gertrude. He absorbs Jonah and becomes the pupil. There was once nothing, then there was something, and then with that something there was fear. As the creatures that feared each other grew and became more, a species that called themselves humans formed. They were petulant, rude, cruel, and fearful. As humans grew, so too did the fears. There became more of them. As they grew, they tried to bring about a new world, one of specific fears, but none of them could do it. One of them, however, saw the truth, the web. It could think and plan. It saw what would happen if they entered the world, but could not change it or stop it alone or tell the other fears. They would not understand. If it could not change the world alone, it would do it with help. It manipulated the stupidest of the fears, the eye, that which can see but does not understand. With the eye, it brought about its new world, one which would finally allow it to escape, but John will not let it. He will starve it. Martin arrives, but he's too late. John tries to explain that this is good, but that John broke his promise and sacrificed himself. John tells Martin that he needs to get the others to call off the plan, that he can make the creatures guarding the gas main leave them alone, and that he can make the world a slightly better place, but Martin refuses to listen. John promised he wouldn't sacrifice himself, and he did so anyway. John says that it'll be okay, but as soon as he begins to explain, he cries out in pain. The gas main has erupted, and John is in agony. As he tells Martin to leave, Martin refuses. He won't leave without John, but John's too far gone. As Martin picks up the knife, John tells him that whatever he chooses, they'll be together. As Martin kisses him, he plunges the knife through John, and the tapes scream. The series ends on a tape recording. Melanie, Georgie, and Bouchard arrived. Everyone else involved with the fears seems to have died. The Admiral's back too, it is almost back to normal. This tape contains all of the archives. Its stories and its contradictions and its holes. It's all there. As Bouchard turns off the tape, she speaks the final words of the series. Good luck.